Part 1. Welcome back to the Slumbering Musicologist. I'm glad you've returned for another journey through music history designed for peaceful rest and deep learning. Tonight, we travel to ancient Sumer, to the land between two rivers, where the world's oldest songs were written down in cuneiform script on clay tablets over 4,000 years ago. These are not merely fragments or theoretical reconstructions. These are actual hymns, with words and musical notation preserved in the archaeological record. We'll explore the hymns sung to the goddess Enheduanna, the drinking songs honoring Ninkasi, the beer goddess, and the temple liturgies that accompany daily rituals in the great ziggurats of Ur, Uruk, and Nippur. We'll discover how these songs were performed, what instruments accompanied them, and what they reveal about Sumerian religious life, social values, and the birth of written music itself. In our previous episode, we examined the broader landscape of ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian music, touching briefly on Sumerian contributions. Tonight, we focus entirely on Sumer, diving deeply into the specifics of this remarkable culture's musical achievements. We will spend our time together, exploring every dimension of Sumerian hymns, from their religious significance to their technical construction, from the lives of the musicians who performed them to their lasting influence on subsequent musical traditions. This is music designed for contemplation, for the quiet hours when your mind can wander freely through history without the distractions of daily life. Let the ancient world unfold gradually, layer by layer, as we move through the darkness of 4 millennia toward understanding. If you find these journeys through music history helpful for rest, consider subscribing. New episodes arrive every Friday at 6 p.m. GMT. Leave the video playing as you drift off, and let the ancient world wash over you like the Tigris and Euphrates rivers once washed over the fertile plains of Mesopotamia. There is no rush, no urgency. History waits patiently for our attention, and tonight we give it fully. Sumer emerged in southern Mesopotamia around 3200 before the Common Era. This was the land we now call Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow toward the Persian Gulf, creating marshlands and fertile plains that sustained some of humanity's first cities. The Sumerians did not call themselves Sumerians. That name comes from much later Akkadian speakers. They called their land Kiengir, which meant something like the land of civilized lords, or the land of the noble lords. They spoke a language unrelated to any other known language family, written in wedge-shaped cuneiform characters pressed into soft clay tablets with a reed stylus. To understand Sumerian music, we must first understand the landscape that shaped it. Southern Mesopotamia was a challenging environment. Rainfall was insufficient for reliable agriculture. The rivers flooded unpredictably, sometimes bringing life-giving silt, sometimes overwhelming destruction. Summers were brutally hot, winters surprisingly cold. Yet from this difficult land, the Sumerians created the world's first urban civilization. They accomplished this through irrigation. Networks of canals channeled river water to fields of barley, the staple grain crop. Date palms provided fruit and timber. Sheep and goats grazed on marginal lands. Fish from the rivers and marshes supplemented the diet. This agricultural surplus allowed for social specialization. Not everyone needed to farm. Some could become craftspeople, merchants, administrators, soldiers, priests, and musicians. By 3000 before the Common Era, Sumer had developed the world's first cities. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, and many others rose from the marshlands, each centered on a massive temple complex called a ziggurat. These were not merely religious structures but economic powerhouses, administrative centers, and cultural hubs. The ziggurat dominated each city's skyline. Imagine a massive stepped pyramid, smaller than Egypt's pyramids but equally impressive in its architectural ambition. Built from millions of mud bricks, some faced with fired brick or white plaster, The ziggurat rose in 3 or more tiers, each smaller than the one below, creating a stepped profile visible for miles across the flat plains. At the summit stood the temple proper, where priests and priestesses performed daily rituals to honor the city's patron deity. These rituals required music, constant, elaborate, carefully prescribed music. The sound of hymns drifting down from the ziggurat's heights became the acoustic signature of Sumerian civilization, marking the passage of days and seasons, announcing festivals, celebrating victories, mourning defeats. Music in Sumer was inseparable from religion, and religion was inseparable from every aspect of life. The gods controlled the floods that brought fertility or destruction. The gods determined whether barley would grow, whether sheep would multiply, whether a king would rule justly. And the gods, the Sumerians believed, delighted in music. They demanded it. Music was humanity's primary means of communication with the divine realm. The Sumerian pantheon was large and complex. Each city had its primary deity. Enlil, lord of the air, was supreme god in Nippur. Nana, the moon god, ruled in Ur. Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, was honored in Eridu. Inanna, goddess of love and war, held special prominence in Uruk. These were not distant, abstract deities, but personalities with preferences, moods, and demands. Each god had specific hymns composed in their honor. These hymns described divine attributes, recounted mythological stories, made petitions for favor, or offered thanksgiving for blessings received. The hymns were not optional extras but essential components of worship. A temple without music was inconceivable, like a temple without offerings or priests. We know this from thousands of cuneiform tablets discovered by archaeologists over the past century and a half. The story of these discoveries is itself fascinating. In the mid-19th century, European and American archaeologists began excavating the tells, large mounds marking ancient city sites that dot the Iraqi landscape. They found palaces and temples, statues and jewelry, weapons and tools, and most importantly, vast libraries of clay tablets. These tablets, once deciphered, revealed the richness of Sumerian civilization. Some tablets contained hymns with complete texts. Some contained instructions for performing rituals, with musical cues embedded in the religious prescriptions. A few precious tablets contained what appears to be actual musical notation, attempts to capture in writing the melodies and rhythms that accompanied sacred words. The oldest complete song we possess comes from around 1900 before the Common Era. It's a hymn to Ninkasi, a goddess of orchards, found at the ancient city of Ugarit in what is now Syria. But this Hurrian hymn, as scholars call it, belongs to a tradition that extends back many centuries earlier into Sumerian culture. The Sumerians developed the conceptual and practical foundations for this musical notation. Deciphering cuneiform was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 19th century. Scholars like Henry Rawlinson, who risked his life copying inscriptions from a cliff face at Behistun in Persia, and George Smith, who discovered the Mesopotamian flood story while working at the British Museum, gradually unlocked the secrets of this ancient writing system. Their work opened a window into a lost world. As more tablets were translated, the sophistication of Sumerian culture became apparent. They had complex mathematics, including a sexagesimal number system, base 60, that we still use for measuring time and angles. They had literature, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving stories. They had law codes, medical texts, astronomical observations, and extensive administrative records tracking every aspect of temple and palace economies. And they had music theory. This was the surprise. Many scholars assumed that ancient peoples had music but lacked theoretical understanding. The Sumerian tablets proved otherwise. These people thought systematically about music, analyzed its components, and developed technical vocabulary for discussing musical concepts. Before we hear their songs, we must understand their instruments. Music theory means nothing without the instruments that produce the sounds, and Sumerian instruments were sophisticated and varied. The development of these instruments represents centuries of experimentation and refinement. The lyre was perhaps the most important instrument in Sumerian music, not the small handheld lyre of later Greek culture, but substantial instruments as tall as a person, with resonating boxes decorated with gold, silver, and precious lapis lazuli. The most famous Sumerian lyre, discovered in the Royal Cemetery of Ur and now in the British Museum, features a golden bull's head with a flowing beard of lapis lazuli. This instrument had 11 strings, probably made from twisted sheep gut or sinew. The construction of a Sumerian lyre was a complex process requiring multiple craftspeople. Woodworkers carved the resonating box from imported timber, likely cedar from Lebanon. Metalworkers created the golden bull's head and other decorative elements. Lapidaries shaped the lapis lazuli, imported at great expense from Afghanistan. String makers twisted animal gut into strands of precise tension and thickness. The assembly of all these components into a functional, beautiful instrument represented a significant investment of resources and skilled labor. Tuning a lyre involved adjusting the tension of each string by turning wooden pegs inserted into the yoke, the horizontal bar that connected the two arms of the instrument. The player would pluck each string and listen carefully, comparing its pitch to a reference tone, gradually bringing all the strings into the desired tuning. This process required trained ears and patient attention. Once tuned, the instrument was fragile. Changes in temperature and humidity affected the gut strings, requiring frequent retuning. The harp was equally important, though distinct from the lyre in construction. Sumerian harps were large, arched instruments, sometimes called bow harps because of their curved shape. Musicians held them vertically and plucked the strings with both hands. Some harps had as few as 4 strings, others as many as 15 or 20. The variation allowed for different musical functions. Small harps might accompany solo singers in intimate settings. Large harps with many strings could play more complex melodies and provide fuller harmonic support. Harp construction differed from lyre construction in several ways. The soundboard, the surface that vibrated to amplify the string's sound, was oriented differently. The strings ran perpendicular to the resonating body rather than parallel to it. This configuration produced a different tonal quality, generally warmer and less bright than the lyre's sound. Harps and lyres often performed together in ensembles, their distinct timbres blending into a rich, complex texture. Drums provided rhythm. Small hand drums, large floor drums, frame drums similar to modern tambourines but without the jingles. Percussion was essential to Sumerian music, marking the rhythms of ritual processions, punctuating the words of hymns, accompanying the movements of dancers in temple courtyards. Different drums produced different sounds. Clay drums with animal skin heads created deep, resonant tones. Wooden drums gave sharper, more defined sounds. Frame drums, held in one hand and struck with the other, could produce both rhythmic pulses and subtle dynamic variations. The balag drum deserves special mention. This was a large bronze drum, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds, permanently installed in temples. The balag drum accompanied specific liturgical compositions called balag songs, laments performed to pacify angry deities. The drum's deep, sustained tones created an atmosphere of solemnity and sorrow appropriate to these ritual contexts. Making a drum involved selecting and preparing animal skins, usually goat or sheep, soaking them, stretching them over a frame or body, and securing them with sinew or leather thongs. The thickness and tension of the skin determined the drum's pitch and tone quality. Skilled drum makers could create instruments with precise sonic characteristics, tuned to complement other instruments in the ensemble. Wind instruments included both flutes and reed pipes. Flutes were made from bone or hollow reeds. The simplest flutes had 3 or 4 finger holes and could play basic melodies. More sophisticated flutes had 6 or more holes, allowing for greater melodic range and complexity. Players produced different pitches by covering or uncovering holes with their fingers, and by varying their breath, pressure, and embouchure, the shaping of the lips and mouth. Reed pipes, the ancestors of modern oboes and clarinets, produced a more penetrating nasal sound. These instruments used a vibrating reed, a thin strip of cane or reed, to generate sound. Single reed pipes produced clarinet-like tones. Double reed pipes, where 2 reeds vibrated against each other, created oboe-like sounds. These were the instruments of shepherds and travelers, portable and durable, suitable for outdoor use, but they also found their way into temple ensembles. The Sumerians also possessed cymbals, rattles, and clappers, all used to enhance rhythmic complexity and add textural variety to musical performances. Cymbals were small bronze discs struck together to produce bright, ringing tones. Rattles contained pebbles, seeds, or small shells inside hollow containers, shaken to create sustained rhythmic textures. Clappers were pairs of flat objects struck together, similar to Spanish castanets but usually made from bone, wood, or ivory. Music in Sumer was a full sensory experience, engaging sight, sound, and the kinetic energy of ritual movement. Performances involved not just musicians but dancers, whose movements were choreographed to complement the music. Visual elements were equally important. Musicians wore ceremonial garments. Instruments were decorated lavishly. The performance space itself, whether temple, courtyard, or palace hall, was designed to enhance both acoustics and visual drama. By 2500 before the Common Era, Sumer had reached its cultural zenith. The city-states competed with one another in wealth, military power, and artistic achievement. Kings commissioned elaborate hymns praising their accomplishments. Temples employed professional musicians, men and women trained from childhood in the art of sacred song, and scribes, those masters of cuneiform writing, began the audacious task of capturing music in written form. This was revolutionary. For thousands of years, music had been purely oral, passed from teacher to student through imitation and memorization. But writing changed everything. Writing allowed for standardization, for preservation, for the transmission of musical knowledge across generations without the distortions inevitable in oral tradition. Writing turned music into a form of literature, something that could be studied, analyzed, and perfected. The implications were profound. Once music could be written, it could be owned, copyrighted in a sense. A temple could claim exclusive rights to perform certain hymns. A royal court could commission compositions that would remain associated with that particular dynasty. Individual composers, like Enheduanna, could claim authorship and have their names remembered long after their deaths. Writing also created new possibilities for musical complexity. When musicians relied solely on memory, compositions needed to be relatively simple and repetitive to remain learnable. Written music could be more elaborate, with complex structures that would be difficult to memorize but easy to perform from notation. This drove musical evolution, encouraging composers to explore new forms and techniques. Part 2. Who created these hymns? In most cases, we do not know. Ancient Sumerian texts rarely credited individual composers. Music was communal property, the heritage of the temple, the gift of the gods themselves. To claim personal authorship would have seemed presumptuous, even blasphemous. The gods inspired music, humans merely transmitted it. This anonymous tradition characterized most ancient music. We know the works, but not the workers. Thousands of hymns survive on clay tablets, each carefully copied by scribes, but most lack attribution. They simply exist, part of the cultural inheritance passed from generation to generation, modified slightly by each successive group of musicians, but never claimed as individual creative property. But we do know about some exceptional individuals. The most remarkable is Enheduanna, high priestess of the moon god Nana at the city of daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who lived around 2300 before the Common Era. We encountered her briefly in our previous episode. Now we must consider her more carefully, because Enheduanna was, quite possibly, the world's first named composer. Enheduanna's very name is significant. En denoted a high priest or priestess. Hedu referred to ornament or decoration. Anna meant heaven. Her name, high priestess, ornament of heaven, expressed her religious function and exalted status. Some scholars believe this was a title rather than a birth name adopted when she assumed her religious office. She composed multiple hymns to the goddess Inanna, and these hymns were copied and recopied for centuries after her death. Sumerian scribes considered her works canonical, essential texts that every educated person should know. Students learning cuneiform writing practiced by copying her poems. Her influence extended far beyond her lifetime, making her not just a composer but a foundational figure in Mesopotamian literature. Her most famous composition is the Exaltation of Inanna, a hymn of extraordinary power and complexity. We will examine this work in detail later, but even a brief consideration reveals its sophisticated structure. The hymn moves through multiple emotional registers, from cosmic praise to personal desperation to triumphant resolution. It employs complex metaphors, vivid imagery, and emotional directness that remains striking even in translation. Enheduanna's position was both religious and political. As high priestess, she mediated between humanity and the divine realm. She performed daily rituals, made offerings, sang hymns, and interceded on behalf of the city and its inhabitants. Her religious authority was absolute within her domain. When she spoke in ritual contexts, she spoke for the goddess. As the daughter of a conquering king, she represented Akkadian authority in a Sumerian city that had been forcibly incorporated into Sargon's empire. Was an ancient, proud city with its own traditions and identity. The installation of an Akkadian princess as high priestess was a political act, a way of binding the conquered city to the new ruling dynasty. Her hymns served multiple purposes. They were genuine expressions of religious devotion. The emotional intensity and theological sophistication suggest authentic spiritual experience, not mere propaganda. But they also legitimized her father's rule by associating his dynasty with the blessings of Inanna, one of Mesopotamia's most powerful deities. Political and religious functions were inseparable. We can imagine Enheduanna in the temple at surrounded by musicians and scribes. The temple complex was vast, with numerous buildings for different functions. The ziggurat rose at the center, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the sunlight. Around it clustered storerooms for grain and other offerings, workshops for craft production, residences for priests and temple staff, courtyards for public rituals, and inner sanctuaries reserved for the most sacred ceremonies. Enheduanna's residence would have been comfortable but not luxurious by modern standards. Mud brick walls, flat roof, small windows for ventilation, furniture limited to low benches, storage chests, and sleeping mats. Yet compared to the living conditions of most Sumerians, this represented privilege. She had servants, received generous rations of food and drink, wore fine garments, and possessed valuable jewelry. She composes her hymns through a process we can only speculate about. Perhaps she sings the words first, working out the melody through repeated performance. Perhaps she dictates the words to a scribe, who records them in cuneiform on a clay tablet. Perhaps the melody comes later, added by professional temple musicians according to established conventions. The creative process in ancient cultures differed from modern composition in important ways. Modern composers often work in isolation, putting notes on paper or computer screen, imagining how the music will sound. Ancient composers work collaboratively, creating music through performance, adjusting it based on audience response, refining it through multiple iterations. Enheduanna probably composed orally, creating phrases and testing them, revising and polishing until she achieved the effect she desired. Only then would the text be written down, fixed in its final form. The melody might remain flexible, varying slightly with each performance, never completely frozen even after the text was fixed. The hymns attributed to Enheduanna share certain characteristics. They are intensely personal, filled with emotional appeals and intimate addresses to the goddess. They describe visions, ecstatic experiences, moments of divine revelation. The speaker, whether Enheduanna herself or a persona she adopted for poetic purposes, experiences direct contact with the divine, speaking to Inanna as one might speak to a friend or family member. They also contain political content, references to specific historical events, praise for particular rulers. The exaltation of Inanna mentions Enheduanna's expulsion from the temple, her suffering during this exile, and her eventual restoration. These references ground the hymn in historical reality, making it not just timeless devotional literature but also historical document. This combination of personal mysticism and political pragmatism makes her work endlessly fascinating. She navigates multiple roles simultaneously: priestess, daughter, woman, poet, political figure, religious authority. Her hymns reflect this complexity, operating on multiple levels at once. Beyond Enheduanna, we know the names of various temple positions related to music. The gala was a type of priest-singer, often associated with lament rituals. These individuals held ambiguous social status. They performed essential religious functions but were somehow set apart from ordinary priests. Some scholars suggest the gala used distinctive vocal techniques, perhaps falsetto or other non-natural voice production, creating sounds associated with the supernatural or divine realms. The nar was a musician, possibly specifically a lyre player. The title appears frequently in economic texts recording rations distributed to temple personnel. A nar received daily allotments of barley, dates, oil, and beer, marking him or her as a professional rather than occasional performer. The quantities varied based on rank within the temple hierarchy and the perceived value of specific individuals' skills. The naru was a female singer. Like the nar, this was a professional position with defined duties and regular compensation. Female singers appear throughout Sumerian temple records, sometimes in positions of considerable authority. They performed not just hymns but also laments, love songs, and other genres. Their social status was generally respectable, though probably not equal to the highest-ranking male priests. The balagdi was a performer of balag songs, a specific type of liturgical composition accompanied by a balag drum. These musicians specialized in lament literature, the songs performed to pacify angry gods or mourn disasters. The balagdi held important ritual responsibility. When performed incorrectly, laments might fail to achieve their purpose, leaving the community vulnerable to continued divine wrath. These were professional positions, not casual amateur musicians. Training began in childhood, often in temple schools where young people learned cuneiform writing, mathematics, and music simultaneously. The curriculum was demanding. Students memorized long lists of cuneiform signs, practiced writing on clay tablets until their hands ached, studied Sumerian language and literature, learned basic arithmetic and geometry, and received musical training appropriate to their intended specialization. A typical day for a young student at a temple school began at dawn. After a simple breakfast of barley bread and dates, students gathered in the school building, a long rectangular room with mud brick benches along the walls. The teacher, An experienced scribe or priest stood at one end, directing the day's activities. Morning hours focused on literacy. Students copied standard texts, learning both the signs themselves and the traditional literature of their culture. They wrote on damp clay tablets using reed styluses, forming the wedge-shaped marks that gave cuneiform its name. The teacher circulated, correcting errors, providing guidance, occasionally administering corporal punishment for particularly egregious mistakes or laziness. Afternoon hours included specialized training. Those destined for musical careers spent time learning instruments, practicing scales and melodies, studying music theory, and memorizing hymns. They listened to experienced musicians perform, learning through imitation and repetition. They learned to tune instruments, to repair broken strings, to maintain and care for valuable equipment. The training lasted years. A child entering temple school at age 7 or 8 might not complete basic education until age 15 or 16. Those pursuing advanced training in specialized areas like music might study well into their 20s. The investment of time and resources was substantial, but it produced highly skilled professionals capable of performing complex duties. A skilled gala or nar enjoyed social prestige and economic security. They received rations from the temple stores, grants of land, sometimes even royal gifts. Particularly talented musicians might be summoned to perform at court, bringing them into contact with the highest levels of society. Success in music could elevate someone from modest origins to comfortable prosperity, but their work was demanding. Temple rituals required precision. A hymn performed incorrectly could offend the gods, bringing disaster upon the entire community. This was not mere superstition, but fundamental religious conviction. The relationship between humans and gods was contractual. Humans provided service, worship, and offerings. Gods provided protection, prosperity, and blessing. If humans failed to uphold their end of the contract, divine retribution was certain. Musicians memorized dozens, perhaps hundreds of hymns, each with its proper melody, rhythm, and ceremonial context. They performed at dawn and dusk, during monthly festivals, at royal coronations, during military campaigns. Music was work, sacred work, but work nonetheless. It required physical stamina, mental concentration, and emotional commitment. The pressure to perform flawlessly was intense. Musicians knew that their fellow professionals judged them critically. Small errors might go unnoticed by lay audiences, but would be immediately apparent to other musicians. Reputation mattered. A musician known for reliable, skilled performance could expect steady employment and generous compensation. One who made frequent mistakes might find opportunities limited. Women played crucial roles in Sumerian music. Female singers and musicians appear frequently in temple records. Some held high-ranking positions, like Enheduanna. Others served as part of larger musical ensembles. Gender roles in ancient Sumer were complex and varied by context, but music was one domain where women could exercise considerable authority and creativity. The participation of women in Sumerian music reflects broader patterns in Sumerian society. Unlike some ancient cultures that strictly segregated men and women, Sumerian society allowed women considerable freedom and opportunity. Women could own property, engage in business, testify in court, and hold religious offices. They were not legal equals to men in all contexts, but neither were they completely subordinated. In music specifically, women seem to have been particularly prominent in certain genres. Love songs, lullabies, and laments were often associated with female performers. But women also sang hymns to both male and female deities, played instruments in temple ensembles, and composed new works. Gender influenced but did not absolutely determine musical roles. The social status of musicians depended partly on their specific function. Those attached to major temples enjoyed higher prestige than itinerant musicians who performed at weddings, funerals, and private celebrations. But even humble musicians were valued, because music was essential to communal life. Without music, the gods grew distant. Without music, crops might fail, enemies might triumph, the cosmic order itself might unravel. This belief in music's cosmic importance was not metaphorical but literal. The Sumerians conceived of the universe as a carefully ordered system maintained through ritual action. The gods created order out of primordial chaos. Humans participated in maintaining that order by performing prescribed rituals at prescribed times. Music was essential to these rituals, not as decoration but as active force. What did Sumerian hymns actually sound like? This is the question that has obsessed musicologists for decades. We have texts, we have some notation, we have descriptions of instruments, but we lack recordings. We lack living practitioners who learned these melodies from unbroken oral tradition. We are reconstructing from fragments, trying to hear music that last sounded 4,000 years ago. Scholars have attempted reconstructions based on various types of evidence. The most important source is a series of tablets from the ancient city of Ugarit, dating to around 1300 before the Common Era. These tablets contain hymns written in Hurrian language but using Sumerian musical concepts and terminology. The tablets include something that looks like musical notation, instructions about which strings of a lyre should be played to produce particular intervals. Professor Ann Kilmer of the University of California, Berkeley, produced the most influential reconstruction of this Hurrian hymn in 1972. She analyzed the notation system, figured out the tuning of the 9-string lyre used in performance, and created a version that could be played on modern instruments. Her reconstruction has been recorded multiple times, and while scholars debate various details, there is general agreement that her approach captures something genuine about ancient Mesopotamian music. Kilmer's work began with painstaking analysis of the notation tablets. The notation used a system of Sumerian interval names indicating the relationships between successive pitches. By understanding these interval names and their mathematical ratios, Kilmer could reconstruct the melodic shape of the hymn. She then applied her knowledge of ancient tuning systems to determine absolute pitches. The result was surprising to many listeners. Ancient music was not primitive or simple, but sophisticated and beautiful. The melody has dignity and grace, moving through its mode with confidence and expressiveness. The intervals sound neither exactly like modern Western music nor like contemporary Middle Eastern music, but occupy their own unique sonic space. The melody is haunting, modal, using intervals and scales that sound neither exactly like modern Western major and minor modes nor like the maqamat of Arabic music. It exists in its own tonal universe, ancient and strange yet somehow deeply familiar, as if these intervals speak to something fundamental in human musical perception. Modes are central to understanding ancient music. A mode is essentially a scale with characteristic melodic patterns and emotional associations. Modern Western music uses primarily two modes, major and minor, though musicians occasionally employ other modal scales. Ancient music used many different modes, each with distinct character. The Sumerian mode underlying the Hurrian hymn emphasizes certain intervals that sound exotic to modern Western ears. There are no functional chord progressions in the Western sense, no harmonic tension and resolution. Instead, the music creates interest through melodic contour, rhythmic variety, and subtle ornamentation. The rhythm is measured and stately, not rushed or overly complex. Each syllable of text receives careful articulation. There are no dramatic dynamic contrasts, no sudden shifts in tempo. The music moves like a river, constant and flowing, carrying the sacred words along its current. This riverine quality was appropriate for Mesopotamian culture, where the Tigris and Euphrates dominated landscape and consciousness. Sumerian hymns typically employed syllabic text setting, meaning each syllable received one or two notes, rarely extended melismas where a single syllable would be stretched over many notes. This made the words paramount, the music a vessel for conveying sacred language to divine ears. The text had to be clearly intelligible. Divine beings were listening, and garbled pronunciation might confuse or offend them. This contrasts sharply with later traditions like Gregorian chant or Islamic Quranic recitation, where melismatic passages, elaborate melodic ornaments on single syllables, became important features. Sumerian aesthetics valued clarity and directness. The beauty of the music came from elegant simplicity rather than virtuosic complexity. The texture was likely heterophonic, meaning multiple musicians played or sang the same melody with individual variations. One lyre player might add ornaments, another might stay closer to the basic melodic line. Singers might embellish certain phrases. This created a thick, shimmering texture, unified in overall melody but rich in detail and variety. Heterophony is common in many traditional music cultures. It allows for individual expression within communal performance. Each musician contributes their personal interpretation while remaining connected to the collective whole. The result is music that sounds unified, yet alive with subtle variation. Accompaniment probably included rhythmic drone notes on lyre or harp, sustained tones that provided harmonic foundation without implying the functional harmony of later Western music. Think of the tanpura in Indian classical music, or the bagpipes drone, rather than chord progressions in the Western sense. These sustained notes created sonic space for the melody to move, providing stability and grounding. Tuning systems in Sumer were based on Pythagorean intervals, perfect fifths and fourths, with various intermediate tones, creating scales of 7 notes within an octave. But these were not the diatonic scales of later Western music. They included different distributions of whole tones and semitones, creating modes with distinctive characters. The mathematics behind these tunings is sophisticated. A perfect fifth has a frequency ratio of 3:2. That is, if one string vibrates at a certain frequency, another string vibrating 3/2 as fast will sound a perfect fifth higher. A perfect fourth has a ratio of 4:3. By building scales using chains of fifths and fourths, Sumerian musicians could create various tonal systems. Some tablets list specific scale types with evocative names: the Ambubum scale, the Ishartum scale, the Kabletum scale, and others. We do not fully understand what made each scale distinct, but the very existence of named scales indicates sophisticated theoretical understanding. Sumerian musicians thought systematically about tuning, about intervals, about the mathematical relationships between pitches. These scale names probably referred to characteristic melodic patterns or emotional associations as much as to specific interval structures. A scale might be called Ishartum not just because it used certain notes, but because it evoked particular feelings or was appropriate for particular ritual contexts. Music theory and musical practice were inseparable. Performance practice probably involved considerable freedom within established frameworks. A hymn had a basic melodic shape, a conventional rhythm, a traditional form, but skilled musicians would personalize their performance, adding ornaments, adjusting phrasing, responding to the acoustics of particular performance spaces. Music was both fixed and flexible, traditional and creative. This balance between convention and creativity characterizes most traditional music. Musicians learn standard forms but are expected to interpret them individually. The goal is not exact reproduction, but creative engagement with tradition. Each performance is unique, yet each remains recognizably part of the same tradition. Ornamentation, the addition of decorative notes around the main melody, was probably important in Sumerian music. Ancient Near Eastern music generally favored ornamentation, and later traditions in the region continued this practice. Ornaments served multiple functions. They added interest and variety to repeated material. They demonstrated the performer's skill and musicality. They helped sustain attention during lengthy performances. Typical ornaments might include trills, rapid alternation between two adjacent notes, mordents, brief dips to a lower neighboring note, turns, elaborate decorations involving several neighboring notes, and slides, smooth transitions between pitches. Each ornament added expressive nuance to the basic melody. Dynamic contrast, variation in loudness, was probably subtle rather than dramatic. Ancient instruments had limited dynamic range compared to modern orchestral instruments. A lyre or harp could produce soft or moderately loud sounds, but not thunderous fortissimos. Singers could similarly vary their volume, but extreme contrasts would have been difficult in large performance spaces without amplification. Instead of dramatic dynamics, performers created interest through subtle variations in timing, articulation, and timbre. A note might be slightly shortened or lengthened. A phrase might be separated cleanly from the next or connected smoothly. The vocal tone might be brightened or darkened. These micro-level variations, almost imperceptible individually, accumulated into expressive, emotionally engaging performances. Music in Sumer functioned at multiple levels simultaneously. Most obviously, it was religious, a means of communicating with gods and goddesses who controlled every aspect of existence. But it was also political, economic, social, and deeply personal. Understanding these multiple dimensions reveals the richness of Sumerian musical culture. Political functions were explicit and important. Kings commissioned hymns celebrating their military victories, their building projects, their supposed divine ancestry. These royal hymns legitimized authority, presenting the king as the god's chosen representative on earth. When a king like Shulgi of Ur claimed to be a skilled musician himself, this enhanced his prestige and demonstrated his refined cultural attainments. Shulgi reigned from 2094 to 2047, before the Common Era. During the Ur III dynasty, he styled himself as a universal king, claiming dominion over all of Sumer and Akkad. His royal inscriptions boast of his many accomplishments, including musical ability. One hymn describes him as follows: I, Shulgi, the noble king, I am a musician, I am a singer, I am a lyre player, I am the one who makes the balag drum resound. Whether Shulgi actually possessed these skills or merely claimed them for propaganda purposes is uncertain, but the claim itself is significant. It reveals that musical ability was considered appropriate and desirable for kings. Music was not menial labor, but an activity worthy of the highest social status. Other royal hymns commissioned by Shulgi describe his supposed divine birth, his favor with the gods, and his accomplishments as builder and administrator. These hymns were performed in temples throughout his empire, creating a sonic propaganda network that reinforced his political authority. Hearing hymns praising Shulgi became part of normal religious experience for his subjects. Economically, music was embedded in the temple economy that dominated Sumerian city-states. Temples owned vast estates worked by dependent laborers. They controlled irrigation systems, grain storage facilities, workshops for craft production. The wealth generated by these enterprises supported not only priests and administrators, but also musicians, scribes, artists, and other specialists. Music was part of this economic system, a service provided in exchange for material support. Temple economies were extraordinarily complex. Thousands of people depended on temple rations for their subsistence. Agricultural workers provided the basic labor. Craftspeople created goods for temple use and trade. Administrators tracked everything meticulously, recording transactions on clay tablets. Musicians occupied a middle tier in this hierarchy, neither the poorest laborers nor the wealthiest administrators, but comfortably situated with secure livelihoods. The economic value of music is documented in numerous administrative tablets. These texts record daily rations distributed to musicians, supplementary payments for special performances, bonuses during festivals, and occasional grants of land or other valuable property. A skilled nar at a major temple could accumulate considerable wealth over a career. Economic security came with obligations. Musicians were expected to perform whenever required, maintain their instruments in good condition, train apprentices, and generally contribute to temple functioning. Failure to fulfill these obligations could result in reduced rations or even dismissal. The relationship between temple and musician was contractual, with defined expectations on both sides. Socially, music reinforced hierarchy and structure. Different types of music accompanied different rituals, and access to these rituals depended on social position. Ordinary people experienced some temple music during public festivals, but much sacred music was performed in inner sanctuaries, heard only by priests, priestesses, and occasionally the king. Music marked boundaries, distinguishing sacred from profane, elite from common, ceremonially pure from impure. This use of music to mark social boundaries appears in many cultures. Certain types of music are reserved for aristocracy, others for commoners. Certain instruments are restricted to particular social groups. Certain songs can be sung only by initiated members of religious or social organizations. Sumerian society used music similarly to enforce and display social hierarchies. Yet music also created community. During major festivals, entire cities participated in ritual processions accompanied by music. Thousands of people sang hymns together, unified in devotion to their patron deity. These communal experiences strengthened social bonds and reinforced shared identity. Everyone, regardless of status, participated in the collective worship that sustained the city's relationship with divine powers. Major festivals occurred throughout the year, following agricultural and astronomical cycles. The New Year festival in spring, around the vernal equinox, was particularly important. It celebrated renewal, the beginning of the growing season, the triumph of order over chaos. Music filled the city for days, continuous performances from dawn to dusk, creating an immersive sonic environment. Other festivals marked the full moon, solstices, equinoxes, and important dates in royal or divine mythology. Each festival had characteristic music. Participants knew what to expect, anticipated familiar hymns and melodies, found comfort in continuity and tradition. At the personal level, music addressed fundamental human concerns. Hymns to Inanna expressed longing for love, fear of abandonment, gratitude for blessings received. Lament songs articulated grief and loss. Drinking songs celebrated friendship and pleasure. Through music, individuals connected with the divine and with each other, finding expression for emotions that transcended ordinary language. Music's ability to express emotion without words makes it universally valuable. Sometimes we feel things too deep or complex for verbal articulation. Music provides alternative expression, conveying emotional states through melody, rhythm, and timbre. Ancient Sumerians understood this. Their hymns gave voice to joy, sorrow, fear, hope, love, anger, and every other human emotion. Personal devotion found expression in music. An individual might learn a particular hymn to a deity they especially revered, singing it privately during personal meditation or crisis. Musicians might compose new verses for traditional hymns, adding personal petitions or thanksgivings. Music bridged public ritual and private spirituality. Music was preserved through oral tradition and writing. Young musicians learned hymns from their teachers, memorizing melodies, rhythms, and texts through repeated performance. But writing provided backup, a way to ensure that important hymns would not be forgotten even if the oral tradition was disrupted by war, plague, or cultural change. The relationship between oral and written transmission was complementary. Oral tradition remained primary. Musicians performed from memory, not from written scores. But written texts served as reference, allowing someone to check their memory against authoritative versions, ensuring that important details were not lost or corrupted over time. Scribal training included memorization of hymn texts. Students learning cuneiform writing would copy hymns as practice exercises, simultaneously learning literacy and religious literature. This integrated education ensured that literate people knew traditional hymns even if they were not themselves musicians. The act of writing music down was itself ceremonial and significant. Scribes were highly educated specialists. The tools of their craft, the reed stylus and clay tablet, were imbued with sacred associations. Nisaba was the goddess of writing and grain, two forms of knowledge and sustenance. To write a hymn was to honor Nisaba, to participate in the divine gift of literacy that elevated humans above animals. Writing technology influenced what could be written. Cuneiform worked well for language but was awkward for musical notation. The notation that survives is somewhat ambiguous, providing instructions rather than complete specifications. This suggests that written notation served as memory aid rather than complete performance score. Musicians still needed training and experience to interpret the notations correctly. Part 3. The Sumerian hymn tradition was not monolithic or unchanging. Over the centuries, from around 3000 before the Common Era to the end of Sumerian as a living spoken language around 2000 before the Common Era, musical styles evolved, new forms emerged, and foreign influences were absorbed and transformed. Early Sumerian hymns, known to us mainly through later copies, tend to be relatively short and formulaic. They state their purpose clearly: praise for a god or goddess, petition for favor, thanksgiving for benefits received. The language is direct, the imagery concrete. These hymns might be only 10 or 20 lines long, suitable for performance during brief ritual moments. These early hymns follow predictable patterns. They begin by addressing the deity by name and listing titles and attributes. Enlil, Lord of the air, King of heaven and earth, Father of gods. The opening establishes the deity's identity and importance, preparing the ground for whatever request or praise follows. The middle section makes the specific request or offers the specific praise. If petitioning for rain, the hymn describes drought conditions and pleads for divine intervention. If celebrating a military victory, it recounts the battle and attributes success to divine favor. The language remains concrete and specific. The conclusion often includes a promise. If you grant this request, we will offer additional sacrifices, or we will sing your praises forever. The relationship between humans and gods is transactional. Humans don't simply demand divine assistance, but offer something in return. Later hymns, particularly those from the Ur-3 dynasty period around 2100 to 2000 before the Common Era, become more elaborate. They employ extended metaphors, complex poetic devices, and lengthy narratives. A hymn might recount the entire mythology associated with a particular deity, weaving together multiple stories into a coherent whole. These developed hymns show greater literary sophistication. They use parallelism, repetition with variation, to create rhythmic and rhetorical effects. They employ similes and metaphors drawn from nature, agriculture, and everyday life. They demonstrate awareness of poetic craft, attention to sound and structure as well as meaning. The development from simple to complex hymns parallels broader trends in Sumerian literature. As literacy spread and the scribal profession became more established, written texts became more elaborate. Literature emerged as distinct from purely functional writing. Poets experimented with language, exploring its aesthetic possibilities. The hymn to Ninkasi, goddess of beer, exemplifies this later style. Composed around 1800 before the Common Era but preserving earlier material, this hymn is simultaneously a devotional text and a practical manual for brewing beer. It describes the entire brewing process in poetic language, from mixing the barley dough to filtering the liquid through a sieve. Let us examine this hymn more closely. It begins with Ninkasi's genealogy, born of the flowing water, tenderly cared for by Ninhursag. Ninkasi, born of the flowing water, tenderly cared for by Ninhursag. The repetition establishes a rhythmic foundation and emphasizes Ninkasi's divine parentage. The hymn then describes brewing step by step. Having founded your town by the sacred lake, she finished its great walls for you. Ninkasi, having founded your town by the sacred lake, she finished its great walls for you. This couplet associates beer making with civilization itself. Towns have walls. Beer has its proper preparation. Both are marks of culture. The description of mixing ingredients becomes poetry. Mixing the batter with sweet aromatics, you spread the couch with a big shovel, and the mash settles in its place. Ninkasi, mixing the batter with sweet aromatics, you spread the couch with a big shovel, and the mash settles in its place. Each step receives similar treatment. The fermentation process. When you pour out the filtered beer of the collector vat, it is like the onrush of Tigris and Euphrates. This simile connects beer making to the great rivers, the source of life in Mesopotamia. Beer flows like rivers. Rivers bring life like beer brings joy. Scholars have used this hymn's instructions to successfully brew ancient Sumerian beer, discovering that it was thick, nutritious, and probably consumed through straws to avoid the sediment. The beer was actually more like liquid bread, nourishing and slightly intoxicating, suitable for daily consumption by workers and celebrants alike. The successful modern brewing of Sumerian beer represents a remarkable feat of experimental archaeology. Researchers identified the ingredients mentioned in the hymn, figured out appropriate quantities and procedures, and produced a drinkable beverage that probably resembles its ancient counterpart. Tasting this beer creates a direct sensory connection with the ancient past. The Ninkasi hymn was likely performed during beer-related rituals and celebrations. Beer was not merely a beverage in Sumer, but a sacred substance, a gift from the gods, essential to social and religious life. Workers received daily beer rations. Festivals featured public beer drinking. Beer was offered to gods on temple altars. To sing the hymn to Ninkasi while drinking her gift was to acknowledge the divine source of this pleasant intoxication. Beer culture in Sumer was sophisticated. Multiple varieties existed, distinguished by strength, flavor, and quality. Some beers were made primarily from barley, others from emmer wheat or mixed grains. Some were flavored with dates, honey, or herbs. Quality varied from rough workers' beer to fine varieties reserved for elite consumption. Taverns existed throughout Sumerian cities. These establishments, often run by women, served beer to customers who sat on benches or mats, drinking from communal jars using long reed straws. Taverns were social centers, places where news was exchanged, business conducted, relationships formed. They were also somewhat disreputable, associated with drunkenness and loose morals. Legal texts mention taverns and beer. The Code of Hammurabi, from 18th century Babylonian period, includes regulations about beer prices and tavern conduct. Overcharging for beer could result in severe punishment. Allowing seditious conversations could result in death for the tavern keeper. Beer was too important to leave unregulated. Regional variations existed within the Sumerian musical tradition. Northern cities like Kish had somewhat different styles than southern cities like Ur or Eridu. Cities in the eastern marsh regions preserved archaic forms that had evolved differently in the western desert edge cities. These variations were probably subtle, differences of detail rather than fundamental structure, but they mattered to people at the time. Each city took pride in its distinctive musical heritage. Regional identity was strong in Sumer. Although the cities shared language, religion, and general culture, each maintained distinct traditions. Emphasized different deities than Uruk. Lagash had different political institutions than Nippur. These differences extended to music. A hymn from would be recognizable in Uruk, but might sound slightly foreign, marked by characteristic melodic turns or rhythmic patterns associated with musical tradition. Musicians traveling between cities would have noticed these variations. A Nar from Lagash performing in Nippur might adjust his style slightly to match local preferences, or he might maintain his home style, his distinctiveness, adding interest and variety to Nippur's musical scene. This circulation of musicians helped spread new ideas while maintaining regional distinctiveness. The relationship between Sumerian and Akkadian music became increasingly complex during the Akkadian Empire period, beginning around 2300 before the Common Era with Sargon of Akkad's conquests. Akkadian was a Semitic language, linguistically unrelated to Sumerian. Akkadian speakers adopted cuneiform writing from the Sumerians and borrowed extensively from Sumerian culture, including musical traditions. This cultural borrowing was not simple imitation but creative adaptation. Akkadian poets translated Sumerian hymns, sometimes preserving original meaning closely, sometimes adapting material to Akkadian sensibilities. Akkadian musicians learned Sumerian repertoire, but also created new compositions in Akkadian language using Sumerian musical structures. Enheduanna, whom we discussed earlier, was ethnically Akkadian, but served as a Sumerian priestess and composed in the Sumerian language. Her hymns represent this cultural fusion. They use Sumerian religious concepts and poetic conventions, but also reflect Akkadian literary sensibilities, creating something new from the combination. The political dimension of this cultural fusion was significant. By adopting Sumerian culture, including its music, Akkadian rulers legitimized their authority. They presented themselves as continuators of ancient traditions rather than foreign conquerors. Music became a medium for negotiating ethnic and political identities. This pattern recurs throughout history. Conquering peoples often adopt cultural practices from conquered populations, using them to create unified political identity. Roman emperors patronized Greek culture. Mongol Khans employed Chinese administrators and artists. Ottoman sultans appreciated Persian poetry and music. In each case, the conquerors recognized that cultural legitimacy required more than military force. By 2000 before the Common Era, Sumerian had ceased to be a spoken language, surviving only as a learned literary and liturgical language similar to Latin in medieval Europe. But Sumerian hymns continued to be copied, studied, and performed for another 1500 years. Babylonian and Assyrian scribes treated these ancient texts as classics, essential components of education and culture. This preservation of dead language for religious and scholarly purposes demonstrates remarkable cultural continuity. Scribes in 1st millennium Babylonia, living 1500 years after Sumerian had ceased as a spoken language, still learned to read and write Sumerian, still studied its literature, still performed its hymns. The connection to ancient tradition mattered profoundly, providing cultural identity and religious authority. Theoretical developments paralleled this literary evolution. Tablets from the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 to 1600 before the Common Era, contain explicit music theory, discussions of tuning systems, interval relationships, and scale structures. These tablets use Sumerian terminology even when written in Akkadian language, indicating the Sumerian origin of the theoretical concepts. One tablet series, known to scholars as the tuning texts, describes 7 different tuning systems for the 9-string Babylonian lyre. Each tuning created a different scale by adjusting the tension of strings in specific patterns. Musicians would select the appropriate tuning based on the type of composition being performed. Some tunings were considered suitable for joyful hymns, others for laments, still others for royal ceremonial music. The tuning texts use technical terminology that musicologists have struggled to interpret. Terms like ishardum, ambubum, and need kablim apparently refer to specific interval relationships, but their exact meanings remain debated. Scholars have proposed various interpretations based on mathematical analysis of possible tuning systems and comparison with later Mesopotamian and Greek music theory. This systematic approach to tuning represents sophisticated musical thinking. It indicates that Mesopotamian musicians conceived of music as a coherent theoretical system, not merely a collection of traditional melodies. They understood the mathematical relationships between pitches, the acoustic properties of instruments, and the emotional effects of different scale types. The mathematical sophistication is particularly impressive. Ancient Mesopotamians were accomplished mathematicians, developing complex computational techniques for astronomy, surveying, and accounting. They applied similar mathematical thinking to music, calculating interval ratios, exploring the implications of different tuning choices, systematizing their theoretical knowledge. Musical notation also developed during this period. The earliest Sumerian tablets with musical content do not contain true notation but rather performance instructions embedded in ritual texts. They might indicate that a particular line should be sung, or that drums should accompany a procession, without specifying exact melodies or rhythms. True notation appears first in the Hurrian hymns from Ugarit around 1300 before the Common Era. This notation uses a system of interval names and string numbers, telling a lyre player which strings to play in which sequence. It does not specify rhythm precisely, suggesting that rhythmic interpretation was left to the performer's judgment based on the text's meter and established performance conventions. The notation system probably represents the culmination of earlier Sumerian experiments with musical writing. The terminology is Sumerian-derived. The concepts reflect Sumerian music theory, even though the language of the text is Hurrian. This suggests that Sumerian musicians had developed notational conventions that spread throughout the ancient Near East. We must also consider the instruments themselves as sources of musical knowledge. Archaeologists have discovered numerous lyres, harps, and other instruments in Sumerian tombs and temple deposits. These physical objects reveal construction techniques, decorative choices, and functional design that inform our understanding of performance practice. The famous golden lyre of discovered by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, is a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Its resonating box is made from wood, now decayed, but originally decorated with shell and lapis lazuli inlays depicting mythological scenes. The golden bull's head that adorns the front is both decorative and acoustically functional, its hollow interior contributing to the instrument's resonance. The inlays on the lyre's resonating box tell stories. One panel shows a procession of animals bearing food and drink, probably representing offerings to gods. Another shows animals engaged in musical performance, a comic reversal where animals play human roles. These images provide insights into Sumerian concepts of music, showing both its sacred importance and its entertainment value. This lyre belonged to a queen, buried with her in the royal cemetery along with attendants who were apparently sacrificed to accompany her into the afterlife. The inclusion of such a valuable instrument in a burial demonstrates the importance of music in Sumerian conceptions of the afterworld. The dead needed music in the next life, just as they had needed it in this one. The royal cemetery at contained multiple musical instruments, not just the famous golden lyre. Woolley discovered harps, lyres of various sizes, and other instruments, all carefully placed in graves along with other grave goods. This concentration of instruments suggests that music accompanied the dead in their journey to the underworld, that the afterlife required proper musical performance just as earthly life did. Sumerian beliefs about the afterlife were generally pessimistic. The underworld was a dreary place of dust and darkness, where the dead existed as pale shadows of their former selves. Yet, even in this gloomy realm, certain amenities were necessary. Food, drink, and apparently music made the afterlife bearable, preventing the dead from becoming restless spirits who might trouble the living. Let us examine 3 specific hymns that exemplify different aspects of the Sumerian tradition. These detailed analyses will help us understand how the various elements we've discussed, historical context, instruments, theory, and performance practice, came together in actual compositions. First, the Exaltation of Inanna by Enheduanna. This hymn consists of 153 lines of poetry, making it one of the longest and most complex compositions in the Sumerian corpus. It is divided into 3 sections: an introduction praising Inanna's power, a central narrative describing a crisis in which Enheduanna loses her position and appeals to the goddess for aid, and a conclusion celebrating Inanna's intervention and Enheduanna's restoration. The hymn opens with cosmic imagery. Inanna is described as the Lady of Heaven, the one who rides on beasts, who destroys mountains, who makes rivers flow backward. These are not gentle pastoral images, but evocations of raw divine power. Inanna is a goddess of war as well as love, of destruction as well as fertility, and Enheduanna does not soften these contradictions but embraces them, presenting Inanna as a deity of totality who encompasses all aspects of existence. The opening lines set the tone. Lady of all divine powers, resplendent light, righteous woman clothed in radiance, beloved of heaven and earth, you of the great breast ornaments, you who love the trustworthy headdress befitting the office of priestess. The imagery is vivid and sensual, emphasizing Inanna's physical presence and adornment. This emphasis on divine physicality was typical of Mesopotamian religion. Gods and goddesses were not abstract principles but personalities with bodies, appetites, emotions. They wore clothing and jewelry, ate food, drank beer, engaged in sexual relations. Treating them as physical beings rather than pure spirits made them more accessible, more comprehensible to human worshippers. The hymn continues with cosmic descriptions. You who have seized all 7 divine powers, you who have hung the 7 divine powers on your hand, you have gathered together the divine powers, you have clasped them to your breast. The number 7 had special significance in Mesopotamian culture, representing completeness and totality. Inanna's possession of all 7 divine powers marks her as supremely powerful. The central section becomes intensely personal. Enheduanna describes being driven from her temple, stripped of her religious office, forced into exile. She calls out to Inanna in desperation. That one has not said to you, I would see it. That one has cast me among the dead. I, the most precious queen, where am I? This emotional directness is striking. Enheduanna addresses the goddess as one might address a friend or family member, with assumed intimacy and expectation of sympathy. The language of this section is raw and plaintive. Me, the woman, the gleaming moonlight. Me, Enheduanna, have you not carried off? Have you not caused me to enter a cleft in the mountains? I myself, as if I were a swallow, have flown out of the window. My life force is exhausted. The crisis described may refer to an actual historical event, perhaps a political upheaval following Sargon's death. Sargon died around 2079 before the Common Era, possibly triggering rebellions throughout his empire. Enheduanna, as his daughter and representative, might have been targeted by rebels seeking to restore traditional Sumerian autonomy. Or the crisis may be metaphorical, representing spiritual crisis, the dark night of the soul that religious practitioners sometimes experience. The ambiguity enriches the text, making it relevant beyond its immediate historical circumstances. Readers across millennia can identify with feelings of abandonment, loss, and desperate appeal to higher powers. The language Enheduanna uses to describe her suffering draws on multiple metaphorical registers. She is like a swallow driven from its nest, a moon obscured by clouds, a precious object discarded. These metaphors accumulate, creating layered emotional impact. We feel her distress not just intellectually but viscerally through the power of poetic imagery. The conclusion celebrates Inanna's vindication of her priestess. The goddess destroys Enheduanna's enemies, restores her to her rightful position, confirms her authority, but the hymn does not end with triumphalism. Instead, it concludes with quiet gratitude. The First Lady of the throne room has accepted Enheduanna's song. This ending emphasizes relationship, the bond between goddess and priestess, rather than mere power or victory. This final section includes a list of Inanna's temple hymns, 42 in total, representing temples throughout Sumer and Akkad. This list served practical purposes, cataloging sacred sites and asserting Inanna's widespread worship, but it also creates aesthetic effect. The accumulation of place names builds rhythmic momentum, creating a sense of Inanna's universal presence. Musically, the exaltation of Inanna would have been performed with lyre accompaniment. The meter is regular, based on stressed syllables in a pattern that facilitates musical setting. Each line would receive a melodic phrase, with slight variations providing shape and interest while maintaining overall unity. The performance probably lasted 20 to 30 minutes, a substantial composition requiring considerable skill from both singer and instrumentalist. The emotional trajectory of the hymn, from cosmic praise to personal desperation to triumphant resolution, would be reflected in musical choices. The opening might use a higher register, bright and confident. The middle section might descend to lower, darker tones, reflecting Enheduanna's distress. The conclusion might return to higher registers, but with added richness reflecting hard-won wisdom rather than naive optimism. Performers would need to navigate this emotional arc skillfully, making the transitions between sections convincing. This requires musical intelligence and emotional sensitivity, not just technical competence. The best performers would make listeners feel Enheduanna's journey, experiencing her triumph as their own. Our second representative work is the hymn to Ninkasi, already mentioned briefly. This hymn is much shorter than Enheduanna's composition, only 39 lines, but equally distinctive in character. Where the exaltation of Inanna is dramatic and personal, the hymn to Ninkasi is celebratory and communal. The hymn begins by establishing Ninkasi's pedigree. She is the daughter of Ninhursag, the mother goddess, and Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. This parentage is symbolically appropriate. Beer comes from grain, which grows from the earth, Ninhursag's domain, and requires water, Enki's element. The hymn thus encodes agricultural and brewing knowledge in mythological form. The opening establishes this genealogy clearly. Born by the flowing water, tenderly cared for by Ninhursag. Ninkasi, born by the flowing water, tenderly cared for by Ninhursag. The repetition creates ritual solemnity, marking this as sacred rather than ordinary speech. The brewing process is described step by step, mixing the ingredients, the bapir, a twice-baked barley bread used as a foundation for brewing, soaking this mixture in a large vat, fermenting the liquid, filtering it through a sieve. Each step receives poetic elaboration, transforming practical instruction into religious poetry. The description of kneading bapir becomes sensual and evocative. Having founded your town by the sacred lake, she finished its great walls for you, Ninkasi. Having founded your town by the sacred lake, She finished its great walls for you. The sacred lake is the fermentation vat. The walls are the vat's rim. Brewing becomes city building, another act of civilization. The fermentation process receives extended attention. Ninkasi, you are the one who soaks the malt in a jar. The waves rise, the waves fall. Ninkasi, you are the one who spreads the cooked mash on large reed mats. Coolness overcomes. The language captures the physical processes, waves of liquid moving in the vat, steam rising from cooked mash spread to cool. One particularly evocative passage describes the filtered beer, the filtering vat, which makes a pleasant sound, you place appropriately on a large collector vat. When you pour out the filtered beer of the collector vat, it is like the onrush of Tigris and Euphrates. This simile connects beer making to the fundamental geographical reality of Mesopotamian life. The two great rivers brought life to the land. Beer brings joy and sustenance to human beings. The parallel is not accidental, but reveals deep cultural logic. The comparison to Tigris and Euphrates elevates beer beyond mere beverage to cosmic significance. These rivers were not just water sources, but manifestations of divine power. Their annual floods determined prosperity or disaster. Comparing beer to these mighty rivers suggests that beer too is divine gift, essential to life and prosperity. The hymn to Ninkasi would have been performed during brewing activities and beer drinking celebrations. Its rhythm would synchronize with the physical labor of brewing, providing structure and meaning to repetitive tasks. Workers would sing together, their voices blending like the ingredients they mixed, creating social cohesion through shared music and shared labor. Imagine a group of brewers working in a temple brewing facility. Large clay vats line the walls. The air is thick with the smell of fermenting grain, yeasty and slightly sour. Men and women work together, stirring, straining, moving heavy containers. As they work, they sing the hymn to Ninkasi, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of their labor. The music transforms work into worship. Physical exertion becomes religious devotion. The boundary between secular and sacred dissolves. Everything done properly, with right intent and correct ritual, becomes sacred act, pleasing to the gods and beneficial to human community. Our third example is a lament for the destruction of Ur, composed after the city fell to Elamite invaders around 2000 before the Common Era. This lament belongs to a genre called the balag, named after the balag drum that accompanied such performances. It represents yet another type of Sumerian hymn, different from Enheduanna's personal devotion and the Ninkasi hymn's celebratory tone. Laments were essential to Sumerian religious practice. When disaster struck, whether natural or human-caused, the proper response was organized mourning. Priests and priestesses performed laments to acknowledge suffering, to seek divine mercy, and to begin the process of restoration. These were not spontaneous expressions of grief, but carefully structured rituals with specific musical and textual requirements. The theological logic behind laments was complex. Disasters occurred because gods were angry, but gods might also be persuaded to show mercy if properly approached. Laments served this purpose, acknowledging human suffering while appealing to divine compassion. They were simultaneously expressions of grief and strategic attempts to change divine disposition. The lament for Ur is heartbreaking even across 4,000 years. It describes the city in ruins, temples destroyed, statues of gods carried off by enemies, survivors wandering in despair. The goddess Ningal, wife of Nanna the moon god and patron of Ur, weeps for her city like a mother for her lost child. The opening establishes the scope of the disaster. The judgment of the land was perversely changed. The council of the land was confused and maliciously changed the destiny of Ur. En and Enlil ordered an evil fate for Ur. The highest gods have decreed Ur's destruction. This is not random misfortune, but divine judgment. One passage captures the devastation with terrible clarity. In no one goes to fetch food, no one goes to fetch water. Those who went to fetch food went to fetch food. They went away from the food. They will not eat that food. Those who went to fetch water went to fetch water. They went away from the water. They will not drink that water. The repetition here is deliberate and powerful. The same phrases recur with slight variations, creating a sense of futility and circular despair. People go for food but don't eat. They go for water but don't drink. Normal life has become impossible. The basic activities that sustain existence no longer function. The description of Ningal's grief is particularly moving. The mother of the city, the pure Ningal, the noble woman, sets up the laments for the temple of her city as if they were songs. She sings the dirge of her city. She herself says, "Alas for my city." She herself says, "Alas for my temple." A goddess mourns like a human mother, her divine status offering no protection from grief. Musically, this would have been rendered as a repeating melodic pattern, each iteration deepening the emotional impact. The balag drum provided steady, ominous rhythm. The vocal line descended gradually, moving from higher to lower registers, creating sense of sinking into despair. Laments employed distinctive musical characteristics. The tempo was slow, the melody predominantly descending, the vocal quality nasal and keening. Drum accompaniment provided steady rhythm, but avoided complex syncopation. The overall effect was mournful without being overwhelming, expressing grief while containing it within ritual form. The performance of laments was highly specialized. Not every musician could perform them properly. Balag singers trained specifically for this function, learning the difficult vocal techniques, the proper drum rhythms, and the extensive repertoire of lament literature. Their performances had to be convincing enough to move gods to compassion, a heavy responsibility. These laments served therapeutic and social functions. They allowed communities to process collective trauma through structured expression. They affirmed that suffering mattered, that loss deserved recognition, and they maintained hope by situating present disaster within a larger framework of divine purpose and eventual restoration. The lament for concludes with partial restoration. Ningal's grief moves the other gods to compassion. They do not fully restore to its former glory, but they allow partial rebuilding. Life continues, diminished but not extinguished. This qualified happy ending reflects realistic acknowledgement that some losses cannot be fully repaired, but also maintains hope that recovery is possible. The Sumerian hymn tradition influenced all subsequent music in the ancient Near East. Babylonian, Assyrian, Hittite, and even early Hebrew music drew on Sumerian models, adapting them to new languages and cultural contexts. Understanding this influence helps us see Sumerian music not as isolated phenomenon, but as foundational tradition that shaped entire regions' musical development. Babylonian music, flourishing after Sumerian decline, maintained many Sumerian elements. Babylonian scribes copied Sumerian hymns, studied Sumerian music theory, and performed Sumerian repertoire in their temples. But they also composed new works in Akkadian language, creating distinctively Babylonian musical style while honoring Sumerian foundations. Babylonian hymns to Marduk, the patron god of Babylon who rose to prominence in the second millennium, show clear structural similarities to Sumerian hymns. They follow similar formal patterns, praise divine attributes using comparable imagery, and make similar petitions for favor. Yet they also reflect distinctively Babylonian concerns, particularly the political theology that elevated Marduk above older Sumerian deities. Assyrian music, from the northern Mesopotamian kingdom that dominated the region in the first millennium, before the Common Era, similarly built on Sumerian foundations. Assyrian palaces featured elaborate musical performances during royal ceremonies. Palace reliefs depict processions of musicians carrying lyres, harps, drums, and other instruments. These visual sources, combined with cuneiform texts describing musical practices, reveal continuity with Sumerian traditions alongside distinctively Assyrian innovations. The Assyrians were particularly famous for military music. Their armies marched to the sound of drums and cymbals, creating intimidating sonic displays designed to terrify enemies. This martial use of music had Sumerian precedents but was developed to new levels of sophistication by Assyrian military culture. Hittite music, from Anatolia, modern Turkey, shows Mesopotamian influence through cultural contact and diplomatic exchange. Hittite texts mention Mesopotamian songs and instruments. Hittite musicians learned Mesopotamian repertoire, apparently considering it prestigious and culturally valuable. This transmission across linguistic and ethnic boundaries demonstrates the broad influence of Mesopotamian musical culture. Biblical psalms show clear structural and thematic parallels with Sumerian hymns: praise for divine power, petition for aid, thanksgiving for blessings, laments for suffering. All these genres have Sumerian predecessors. The poetic devices of parallelism and repetition that characterize Hebrew poetry also appear in Sumerian texts. Consider Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd." Its structure, a series of parallel phrases building to affirmation of trust, resembles many Sumerian hymns. The imagery of divine care, protection from enemies, preparation of bountiful feast, these themes appear throughout Sumerian literature. The connections suggest shared tradition, though the specific lines of transmission remain debated. This is not to claim that biblical psalms directly copied Sumerian hymns. The relationship is more complex. Sumerian culture established templates, conventional ways of addressing the divine through music and poetry. These templates spread throughout the ancient Near East, carried by traders, diplomats, scribes, and conquered peoples. Each culture adapted these templates to its own needs and sensibilities. The Israelites entered Canaan after spending time in Mesopotamia according to biblical tradition. Abraham supposedly came from Ur. Later, the Babylonian exile took Israelite elites to Mesopotamia for several generations. These historical connections provided opportunities for cultural transmission, including musical influences. Yet biblical psalms also show distinctively Israelite characteristics. Monotheism, the worship of single universal God rather than multiple deities, transforms the theological context. Covenant theology, the idea of special relationship between God and Israel, differs from Mesopotamian concepts of human-divine relations. These differences shaped how biblical poets adapted Mesopotamian templates. Greek music also shows possible Mesopotamian influence, though the connections are harder to trace. Pythagorean music theory, with its emphasis on mathematical intervals, may reflect ideas that originated in Mesopotamia and traveled westward. The Greek kithara resembles the Mesopotamian lyre in construction and playing technique. Greek modes have structural similarities to Mesopotamian scales. Pythagoras, the philosopher and mathematician who lived around 570 to 495 before the Common Era, supposedly traveled to Egypt and possibly Babylonia during his youth. Whether he actually made these journeys is uncertain, but even the tradition that he did suggests cultural connections between Greece and the Near East. Mathematical approaches to music could have transmitted through such contacts. Greek modes, scales with characteristic patterns of whole tones and semitones, show similarities to Mesopotamian scale systems. Both cultures recognize that different scales produce different emotional effects. Both develop technical terminology for discussing these differences. Whether this represents independent discovery or cultural transmission remains unclear. but we must be cautious about claiming direct influence. Similar musical solutions sometimes arise independently in different cultures, and the evidence for transmission from Mesopotamia to Greece is circumstantial rather than conclusive. Greeks might have developed their musical ideas independently, arriving at similar conclusions through their own observations and experiments. What is clear is that Sumerian music represents humanity's first successful attempt to capture music in writing, to theorize about musical structure, and to integrate music into complex urban civilizations. These achievements laid foundations that subsequent cultures built upon, adapted, and transformed. The invention of musical writing alone represents enormous achievement. For thousands of years, music existed only in performance, dying the moment it sounded. Writing gave music permanence, allowing compositions to survive their composers, to spread beyond their original performance contexts, to accumulate into repertoires that future generations could study and learn from. Modern musicians have attempted to revive Sumerian music. Anne Kilmer's reconstruction of the Hurrian hymn has been performed and recorded multiple times. Various early music ensembles have experimented with Mesopotamian repertoire, building replica instruments and researching performance practices. These efforts, while speculative, connect contemporary listeners with the ancient world in visceral ways that scholarship alone cannot achieve. The Ensemble de Organografia, specializing in ancient Mediterranean music, has produced recordings of reconstructed Mesopotamian music. They use replica instruments built according to archaeological evidence, apply what we know about ancient tuning systems, and attempt to recreate authentic performance practices. The results are beautiful and evocative, giving modern listeners some sense of how ancient music might have sounded. Peter Pringle, mentioned earlier, has made numerous recordings of Sumerian hymns using replica lyres he constructed himself. He learned to build lyres by studying museum artifacts and archaeological reports, mastering ancient construction techniques. His performances emphasize the meditative, contemplative qualities of this music, making it accessible to contemporary audiences seeking peaceful listening experiences. These modern reconstructions serve multiple purposes. Academically, they test scholarly theories, forcing musicologists to translate abstract ideas into actual sounds. Culturally, they preserve knowledge of ancient music that might otherwise fade from collective memory. Personally, they allow individual listeners to connect with human creativity across vast gulfs. Part 4. While Sumerians were developing their musical tradition in Mesopotamia, what was happening elsewhere in the ancient world? Music is universal to human cultures, but the forms it takes vary enormously. Comparing Sumerian music with contemporary traditions in other regions reveals both commonalities and distinctive features, helping us understand what makes Sumerian music both uniquely itself and recognizably human. In Egypt during the 3rd millennium, before the Common Era, music was equally important to religious and courtly life. Egyptian civilization developed along the Nile River Valley around the same time as Sumerian civilization emerged in Mesopotamia. Both cultures faced similar challenges, transforming river valleys through irrigation into productive agricultural landscapes capable of supporting complex urban societies. Egyptian harps resembled Sumerian harps in basic construction but differed in details. Egyptian harps often had more strings and a more elegant curved form. They ranged from small portable instruments to enormous harps taller than a person, requiring the musician to stand while performing. The variety suggests sophisticated musical culture with different instruments for different contexts. The sistrum, a metal rattle sacred to the goddess Hathor, had no Sumerian equivalent. This instrument consisted of a metal frame with loose rods that rattled when shaken. It produced bright, percussive sounds used in ritual contexts, particularly those associated with female deities. The sistrum's distinctive sound became one of Egyptian music's signature timbres. Egyptian tomb paintings depict elaborate musical ensembles with dancers, singers, and multiple instrumentalists, suggesting performance contexts similar to Sumerian temple rituals but with distinctive Egyptian aesthetics. One famous painting from the tomb of Nakht, a scribe and priest who lived around 1400 before the Common Era, shows three female musicians. One plays the double flute, another the lute, the third the harp. All three are beautifully dressed, their hair adorned with flowers, suggesting that musical performance was associated with beauty, pleasure, and refined culture. These visual sources are invaluable but also frustrating. We can see exactly what musicians looked like, what instruments they held, even what movements they made, but we cannot hear the music. The paintings are silent, and hieroglyphic texts describing music use metaphorical language that resists literal interpretation. We have no Egyptian music notation from this early period. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing could represent speech, but apparently was not adapted to musical notation. This means our knowledge of Egyptian music relies entirely on visual representations, descriptions in texts, and archaeological instruments. We can see what musicians looked like, what they held, but we cannot hear their songs. Some scholars have attempted reconstructions of Egyptian music based on later sources, instruments discovered in tombs, and comparative analysis with other ancient Near Eastern traditions. These reconstructions are more speculative than reconstructions of Mesopotamian music, lacking the theoretical texts and notational systems available for Mesopotamia. Despite these limitations, we can identify some probable characteristics of Egyptian music. It likely used modes similar to those in other Near Eastern traditions. It probably featured heterophonic texture, with multiple performers playing or singing the same melody with individual variations. It certainly employed both sacred and secular genres, with music accompanying religious rituals, courtly entertainments, work activities, and private celebrations. The relationship between Egyptian and Mesopotamian music remains unclear. The two civilizations traded goods and exchanged diplomatic missions, providing opportunities for cultural transmission. Musicians might have traveled between Egypt and Mesopotamia, carrying songs and techniques across the intervening desert, but evidence for specific musical exchange is limited. The Indus Valley Civilization, flourishing in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India from around 3300 to 1300 before the Common Era, has left even less evidence of musical culture. Archaeological excavations have revealed some possible musical instruments, but the Indus script remains undeciphered. We cannot read their texts if they had texts about music, and so cannot know whether they wrote about music or developed music theory. The Indus Valley cities were remarkably sophisticated, with planned street grids, advanced drainage systems, and standardized weights and measures. This level of organization suggests complex culture that probably included sophisticated music, but without written records or clear visual evidence, we can only speculate. Some small clay objects discovered at Indus sites might be rattles or bells. Some terracotta figurines might depict dancers or musicians, but interpretation is uncertain. These objects could have various functions, and we cannot be confident about their musical significance. However, given the sophistication of Indus Valley urban planning, metallurgy, and other technologies, it seems likely that they possessed equally sophisticated musical traditions. The continuity between ancient Indus culture and later Indian music is debated among scholars, but some possible connections exist. Later Indian music theory, documented in Sanskrit texts from the first millennium before the Common Era, shows remarkable sophistication. If this theoretical knowledge has deep roots, it might extend back to Indus Valley civilization. In China, the Neolithic Yangshao and Longshan cultures produced bone flutes that have been dated to as early as 7000 before the Common Era. These are among the oldest playable musical instruments ever discovered. Archaeological excavations at Jiahu in Henan province uncovered flutes made from the wing bones of the red-crowned crane, carefully crafted with 5 to 8 finger holes. Modern musicians have played replicas of these instruments, producing clear, pleasant tones. The survival of these flutes demonstrates that music existed in China thousands of years before writing. The sophistication of their construction, with carefully placed finger holes producing specific pitches, indicates that even Neolithic Chinese peoples understood basic acoustics and scale construction. Later, during the Shang dynasty, around 1600 to 1046, before the Common Era, Chinese bronze bells and stone chimes demonstrate advanced metallurgical and acoustic knowledge. Chinese bronze casting techniques were among the most sophisticated in the ancient world, producing elaborate ritual vessels and musical instruments. Bronze bells of various sizes, when struck, produce different pitches, allowing for melodic performance. Chinese music theory, based on 5-note pentatonic scales, differs fundamentally from Mesopotamian heptatonic scales, suggesting independent development. The pentatonic scale, using 5 notes within an octave rather than 7, creates a different sonic palette. Much traditional Chinese music uses pentatonic scales, giving it a distinctive character that sounds immediately recognizable as Chinese to Western ears. This difference in scale structure probably reflects different aesthetic priorities and philosophical frameworks. Chinese music theory was integrated into broader cosmological and philosophical systems. The 5 notes of the pentatonic scale were associated with the 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, water, and with various other sets of 5, the 5 directions, 5 seasons, 5 planets, 5 organs of the body. Music was part of a comprehensive worldview in which everything connected to everything else through systematic correspondences. Europe during the 3rd millennium before the Common Era was populated by Neolithic agricultural communities and nomadic pastoralists. These peoples certainly possessed music, but they left no written records and few identifiable musical instruments. Stone Age European music remains largely mysterious, accessible only through speculative interpretation of archaeological remains and ethnographic analogy with traditional music from pre-literate societies. Some European archaeological sites have yielded possible musical instruments. Clay drums, bone flutes, and whistles have been discovered in various contexts. Rock art from some sites might depict dancing figures, suggesting that movement and music were connected in prehistoric European cultures as in other cultures. But without writing or more substantial archaeological evidence, we cannot say much specific about Stone Age European music. It probably included vocal music, possibly with simple instrumental accompaniment. It probably served ritual purposes, marking important ceremonies and life transitions. It probably varied regionally, with different local traditions developing in relative isolation. The megalithic monuments of Neolithic Europe, massive stone structures like Stonehenge in England or Newgrange in Ireland, might have acoustic properties that influenced their ritual use. Some scholars have suggested that these monuments were designed partly for their acoustic effects, amplifying voices or creating reverberations that enhanced ritual experiences. If true, this would indicate sophisticated awareness of sound and space even without written music. The Americas were inhabited by diverse peoples with rich musical traditions, but we have virtually no archaeological evidence for specific musical practices from this early period. Later Native American music emphasizes vocals, drums, rattles, and flutes, but whether these instruments and styles were continuous from remote antiquity is uncertain. The diversity of Native American cultures across 2 continents suggests equally diverse musical traditions. Some of the oldest human remains in the Americas, dating back 12,000 years or more, occasionally include objects that might be musical instruments. Bone flutes, rattles, and possible drums have been found at various sites, but interpretation is challenging, and we cannot reconstruct specific musical practices from these scattered remains. Africa presents similar challenges. Music has always been central to African cultures, but the archaeological and written record before the first millennium, before the Common Era, is sparse. Climate and environment have not favored the preservation of musical instruments made from organic materials. What we know about ancient African music comes primarily from much later sources, making extrapolation backward risky. Yet some generalizations seem reasonable. African music has probably always emphasized complex rhythms, with multiple interlocking drum patterns creating dense polyrhythmic textures. Vocals have probably always been central, with call and response patterns allowing for communal participation. Music has probably always been integrated into daily life, rather than separated into distinct performance contexts. These characteristics appear so consistently across diverse African cultures, separated by vast distances and different historical trajectories, that they probably reflect very ancient traditions. The specific forms change, but underlying principles persist, suggesting deep continuities in African musical culture. This survey reveals that Sumerian music is unique not necessarily in its actual sounds, which we cannot fully reconstruct, but in its documentation. The Sumerians wrote about music, theorized about it, and left sufficient evidence that modern scholars can engage seriously with their musical culture. Other ancient peoples may have had equally sophisticated music, but without writing or with writing systems that did not capture musical information, their traditions remain obscure. Yet certain musical universals seem to transcend cultural boundaries. All known human societies use music in religious rituals. This connection between music and the sacred appears to be fundamental to human culture. Whether we interpret it as music putting us in contact with supernatural realities or as music activating psychological states we interpret religiously, the connection exists across all cultures. All distinguish between sacred and secular music, even if the specific distinction varies. Some music is appropriate for religious rituals, other music for entertainment or work. The boundaries differ by culture, but the basic distinction appears universal. This suggests that music's multiple functions, religious, social, personal, require different forms and contexts. All employ rhythm, melody, and some form of musical structure, even if the specific rhythms, melodies, and structures differ radically. Human musical cognition seems to require organization. Random sounds do not constitute music. Sounds must be organized according to some principle, however simple or complex, to be experienced as music rather than noise. Instruments fall into categories that appear across cultures: percussion, wind, and string instruments. The specific forms vary, but the basic principles, striking something to make it vibrate, blowing air through a tube, plucking or bowing a tensioned string, these appear repeatedly in unconnected musical traditions. This probably reflects physical constraints. There are only so many ways to produce musical sounds using available materials and human body capabilities. Music's social functions also show cross-cultural patterns. Music creates group cohesion, facilitating collective action and shared identity. Music marks important life events like births, initiations, marriages, and deaths, providing structure and meaning to these transitions. Music facilitates communication with the divine or spiritual realm, whatever form that takes in particular culture. These functions appear in Sumerian music and in the music of virtually every other human society. What makes Sumerian music historically significant is not that it was radically different from other ancient music, but that it was documented. The hymns preserved on clay tablets, the music theory texts, the descriptions of instruments and performances. These sources allow us to engage with specific ancient musical works, rather than making vague generalizations about primitive or early music. How were Sumerian hymns actually performed in their original contexts? Modern concert performances and recordings, even those attempting historical accuracy, differ inevitably from ancient practice. We must imagine the sensory totality of a Sumerian religious ceremony to understand the music's full significance. Music did not exist in isolation, but as part of comprehensive ritual experiences engaging all senses. Consider a temple ritual at dawn. The eastern sky begins to brighten, transforming from black to deep blue to pale gray. The ziggurat rises against this lightning sky, its whitewashed mud brick walls catching the first rays of sun. Priests and priestesses emerge from the temple's inner sanctum, where they have prepared offerings of bread, beer, dates, and meat. They carry these offerings in procession down the ziggurat's steep stairs toward the courtyard below. Musicians accompany the procession. A nar carries a large lyre, its bull's head gleaming with gold leaf. The instrument is heavy, requiring both hands to support it. A naru walks beside him, ready to sing. Behind them come percussionists with frame drums and clappers. The sound begins even before the hymn proper, rhythmic pulses that mark the processional pace, audible cues coordinating movement through space. The stairs descending the ziggurat are steep and narrow. The procession moves slowly, carefully, maintaining dignity despite physical challenge. The rhythm of drums synchronizes with footsteps, each beat marking another stair descended. The music structures the movement, making the dangerous descent safer by providing steady temporal framework. The courtyard fills with people, priests and lay worshippers standing in designated areas according to their status and ritual purity. Everyone knows this hymn, has heard it countless times, but it never becomes routine. This is the moment when the god accepts or rejects the offering, when divine favor is secured or withheld. The music matters. It must be performed correctly, with proper reverence and technical precision. The lyre plays an introduction, establishing the melodic mode. The music fills the courtyard, bouncing off stone walls, rising toward the open sky. The nar's fingers move with practiced precision, plucking strings in patterns learned through years of training. Each note sounds clearly, distinctly, before fading into the next. The tempo is measured, neither rushed nor dragging, allowing each musical gesture to register fully. Then the singer enters, her voice strong and clear, trained from childhood for this purpose. She sings in Sumerian, the sacred language, even though many in the courtyard speak Akkadian in daily life. The words invoke the deity by name, listing divine attributes, making the formal request for blessing. Her voice carries easily across the courtyard, reaching even those standing at the margins. The melody follows conventions established over centuries. Certain intervals convey reverence, others supplication, others joy. The singer knows these associations implicitly, shaping each phrase to reinforce the emotional content of the text. She does not merely recite words but embodies them, becoming temporarily a channel between human and divine realms. Her vocal production technique differs from modern Western classical singing. No vibrato, the slight wavering of pitch that characterizes opera singing. No dramatic dynamic contrasts, no swelling to powerful climaxes. Instead, the voice remains steady, focused, clear. Each word receives precise articulation, ensuring intelligibility. The text must be understood, both by human listeners and by the divine being addressed. The lyre accompaniment is not merely supportive but dialogic. It answers the voice, echoes melodic phrases, provides interludes between verses. The musician's fingers move with practiced precision, plucking strings in patterns that blend into the overall soundscape while maintaining individual character. He listens to the singer, adjusting his playing to match her phrasing, maintaining perfect coordination without need for visible cues. Drums punctuate key moments. The rhythm is steady but not mechanical, breathing with the music's natural phrasing. Percussionists watch the singer and lyre player, responding to subtle cues, adjusting their playing to maintain ensemble cohesion. When the text describes divine power, drums might intensify slightly. When the text makes supplication, drums might soften. These dynamic nuances, subtle but perceptible, enhance the text's emotional content. The acoustics of the temple courtyard shape the sound. Stone walls reflect high frequencies, creating brightness and clarity. The open sky prevents excessive reverberation, keeping the texture clean. Distance from the performers affects what each listener hears. Those close to the musicians experience the music's full detail. Those farther away perceive a blended, softer version. Visual elements complement the auditory experience. Musicians wear ceremonial garments, their appearance as carefully prescribed as the music itself. The nar might wear a white linen robe with a colored sash indicating his rank within the temple hierarchy. The naru's garments include elaborate jewelry, gold earrings, and necklaces that catch the morning light. Their appearance honors the god while displaying the temple's wealth and status. The instruments are decorated with precious materials, their beauty honoring the god who receives the offering. The lyre's golden bull's head represents not just craftsmanship but theological symbolism. Bulls were associated with multiple deities, particularly Nana, the moon god. The bull's power and fertility made it appropriate divine symbol. Incense smoke rises from braziers placed around the courtyard, its fragrance blending with the music to create a total sensory environment. The smell might be frankincense imported from Arabia or local herbs with aromatic properties. The smoke drifts lazily upward, visible in slanting morning light, creating visual poetry that complements the auditory poetry of the hymn. The hymn concludes, but the ceremony continues. The offerings are carried into the inner sanctum and placed before the god's statue. More prayers are spoken, this time without music. Then the food is redistributed, some portions consumed by priests in the god's name, representing divine acceptance of the offering, others distributed to temple dependents and sometimes to the public, creating material connection between divine and human realms. This entire process might last an hour or more. The music occupies perhaps 10 or 15 minutes of that time, but its importance extends beyond its duration. Without the music, the ritual would lose efficacy. The gods require proper address, and music is the medium through which that address is most effectively delivered. Evening rituals follow similar patterns but with different emotional qualities. Morning hymns emphasize awakening, renewal, the beginning of a new day under divine protection. Evening hymns speak of completion, rest, gratitude for the day's blessings. The melodies might use the same scales and similar structures, but subtle differences in tempo, dynamics, and ornamentation convey these distinct meanings. The choice of musical mode probably corresponded to ritual function. Joyful festivals might use brighter modes with major-like interval patterns. Lament rituals would use darker modes with more minor-like qualities. Royal ceremonies might use particular modes associated with power and authority. This systematic correspondence between mode and meaning indicates sophisticated understanding of music's emotional effects. Special festivals required special music. Annual celebrations of the new year, monthly observances of the full moon, occasional rituals to address specific crises, each had its appropriate repertoire. Musicians had to know dozens of hymns, each associated with particular occasions, deities, and ritual actions. Their memories contained the temple's entire musical heritage. Training for this level of competence began early. Children destined for musical vocations entered temple schools around age 7 or 8. They learned cuneiform writing, mathematics, and music simultaneously. Writing allowed them to study hymn texts. Mathematics helped them understand musical ratios and tuning systems. Music itself required years of patient practice. Young musicians began by memorizing simple hymns, gradually advancing to more complex compositions. They learned to play instruments, starting with small hand drums and progressing to harps and lyres. They studied music theory, learning the names and characteristics of different modes, the proper tunings for various contexts, the conventions governing melodic ornament and rhythmic interpretation. By their teenage years, talented students might participate in actual temple ceremonies, performing under the supervision of senior musicians. They learned not just the notes, but the comportment required of sacred musicians, how to walk in procession, where to stand, when to bow, how to coordinate with other performers. Musical training was also social training, teaching proper behavior and ritual decorum. Adult musicians continued refining their skills throughout their lives. Music was not static but evolving. New hymns were composed, old ones adapted, performance practices adjusted to changing tastes. A successful nar or naru needed artistic sensitivity as well as technical competence, capable of personalizing performances within traditional constraints. The pressure to perform flawlessly was intense but not paralyzing. Musicians knew that small errors happened and could be corrected. What mattered was overall effect, the successful completion of ritual, the satisfaction of divine requirements. Perfectionism would be counterproductive, creating anxiety that interfered with performance. Instead, musicians cultivated calm confidence, trusting their training and experience. Behind the formal rituals and theoretical sophistication were individual human beings with personal experiences, emotions, and relationships. Reconstructing these human dimensions is challenging, but tablets occasionally preserve glimpses of the people who created and performed this music. These fragments, scattered across thousands of documents, allow us to recognize common humanity across 4 millennia. Economic texts record the rations distributed to temple musicians. A nar at might receive daily allotments of barley, dates, oil, and beer, supplemented by occasional grants of wool for clothing or land for cultivation. The quantities varied by rank and reputation. A newly qualified nar might receive minimum rations, barely sufficient for subsistence. A senior, respected nar could expect generous allotments, enough to support a family comfortably. These records reveal that musicians were valued but not wealthy, comfortable but not exempt from the economic pressures facing other temple dependents. They occupied a middle position in temple hierarchy, above manual laborers but below high-ranking administrators and priests. This status was secure but not privileged, requiring continued competent performance to maintain. Some tablets contain complaints. A musician protests that his rations have been reduced unfairly. He claims to have performed all required duties but received less compensation than promised. The complaint follows formal procedures, addressed to temple administrator, stating facts clearly, requesting correction. We don't know the outcome, but the existence of complaint procedures indicates that musicians had recourse when treated unjustly. Another tablet contains a singer's claim that she deserves promotion to a higher rank within the temple hierarchy. She lists her qualifications, years of service, special training in difficult repertoire, successful performances at major festivals. She requests that administrators recognize her achievements with increased rations and higher status. This petition shows that advancement was possible, that skill and dedication could improve one's position. These documents show that musical life involved politics, competition, and sometimes conflict. Musicians competed for positions, sought patronage from influential figures, formed alliances with colleagues. The temple was not idealized spiritual community but workplace with all the complexity that entails. Personal names sometimes reference musical activities. A child might be named chosen by Enlil, or sweet is the voice of Inanna, reflecting parents' hopes that their offspring would become musicians or singers. These names indicate that musical ability was valued and that association with sacred music brought prestige to entire families. Other names reference specific instruments. Lyre player of Nana or drummer of Ningal identified individuals by their musical specialization. These names followed people throughout their lives, becoming part of their permanent identity. Musical profession was not temporary occupation, but core aspect of self. Letters occasionally mention music. A king writes to an administrator requesting that a particularly skilled lyre player be sent to the palace. The king has heard of this musician's reputation and wants him for an important ceremony. The administrator must comply, but the letter's polite phrasing suggests negotiation rather than simple command. The musician has value that must be respected. A father writes to his son studying at a temple school, encouraging him to practice diligently. Work hard at your music studies, he advises. A skilled nar never lacks food or respect. The letter combines paternal concern with practical wisdom. Musical training opens opportunities, but only if pursued seriously. These fragments suggest that ancient people experienced music with the same mixture of duty, pleasure, pride, and frustration familiar to musicians across all eras. Music was work, but work that could be satisfying. Music required discipline, but discipline that led to mastery. Music involved social relationships, both supportive and competitive. Gender dynamics in Sumerian music were complex. Women held important musical positions, but certain roles were restricted by gender. The gala priests were exclusively male, often associated with special vocal techniques that may have involved falsetto singing or other distinctive vocal production. These techniques set gala apart from ordinary singers, marking them as special, somewhat liminal figures. Female singers, the Naru, held distinct positions with different responsibilities. They sang at festivals, weddings, funerals, and other occasions requiring female presence. Their repertoire included love songs, lullabies, and other genres associated with women's experiences, but they also sang hymns to both male and female deities, played instruments in temple ensembles, and performed essential ritual functions. Yet, Enheduanna's career demonstrates that exceptional women could achieve remarkable authority. As high priestess and composer, she exercised both religious and political power. Her hymns were copied for centuries, treated with the same reverence accorded to texts by male authors. Gender mattered in Sumerian society, influencing opportunities and expectations, but it did not absolutely determine possibilities. The status of female musicians probably varied by context. In major temples where women held priestly offices, female musicians enjoyed respect and security. In smaller contexts where women's religious authority was more limited, female musicians might face marginalization. As in most societies, gender's effects depended on intersections with class, ethnicity, family connections, and individual ability. Aging musicians faced particular challenges. Musical performance requires physical capacity, manual dexterity, vocal strength, memory. As musicians aged, these capacities diminished. A lyre player's fingers might stiffen with arthritis. A singer's voice might lose its clarity and power. Memory for complex repertoire might fade. Temple systems accommodated aging through transitions to different roles. An elderly nar might shift from performance to teaching, passing knowledge to younger generations, or he might receive honorific position, advisor role that provided support without demanding active performance. These transitions allowed experienced musicians to continue contributing while acknowledging physical limitations. Some texts mention elderly musicians with obvious respect. The old nar who knows everything appears in several contexts, suggesting that seniority brought authority. Young musicians sought instruction from elderly masters, learning not just techniques but also stories, histories, and traditions that gave meaning to musical practice. The economic vulnerability of musicians appears in lament texts. When disaster struck, musicians suffered along with everyone else. War, famine, flood, these destroyed the temple economies that supported musical life. Instruments were lost or damaged, performance spaces ruined, patrons killed or impoverished. Rebuilding musical culture was part of rebuilding civilization itself. Yet music also provided consolation during disasters. The lament tradition emerged specifically to address suffering, giving voice to grief and maintaining hope for restoration. Musicians who survived catastrophes had important work to do, helping their communities process trauma through structured ritual expression. Music's therapeutic function became most visible during crises. Daily life for musicians involved more than ritual performance. They practiced, maintained their instruments, taught students, composed new works or adapted old ones, participated in temple administration. A successful musician was part artist, part craftsperson, part religious functionary, part civil servant. The variety kept life interesting but also demanding. Relationships between musicians shaped musical culture. Teachers and students formed bonds that lasted lifetimes. A student might study with the same master for 10 or 15 years, developing deep personal connection alongside musical expertise. These relationships transmitted not just technique but also values, approaches to music, understandings of its purpose and significance. Musicians from different cities might meet during festivals, exchanging repertoire and techniques. A Nar from Lagash visiting for a major ceremony would interact with local musicians, perhaps performing together, certainly talking about music, comparing local traditions, sharing new compositions. These interactions spread musical innovations while maintaining regional distinctiveness. Royal musicians traveled with kings on military campaigns or diplomatic missions, spreading musical styles across regions. When a king visited another city, his musicians came along, performing for local audiences, demonstrating their patron's cultural refinement. Host cities reciprocated, showcasing their own musical traditions. These exchanges enriched everyone's musical understanding. Occasionally, we glimpse personal pride and craftsmanship. A lyre maker signs his work, made by Nanshe, craftsman of This signature indicates that he understood his contribution as artistry, not merely labor. His lyres were not generic products, but individual creations bearing his personal stamp. This pride in craft quality appears throughout Sumerian culture. An instrument becomes an heirloom, passed from parent to child, accumulating history and sentimental value beyond its utilitarian function. "The lyre that belonged to my father, may it serve me well," reads one text, suggesting emotional attachment to specific instruments. They were not mere tools but companions, partners in creating beauty. Music intersected with other art forms, creating comprehensive aesthetic experiences. Hymn texts are literature, employing sophisticated poetic techniques. Temple architecture was designed for acoustic properties as well as visual grandeur, creating spaces where music sounded optimal. Instrument decoration combined metalwork, wood carving, and inlay, bringing together multiple craft traditions in single objects. The Sumerian saying, "Song is a good thing," appears in several contexts, expressing cultural values about music's importance. Another saying advises, "Let there be song in your heart," suggesting that music's value extends beyond formal performance to personal disposition and outlook. These proverbs capture folk wisdom about music's role in good life. These fragments, scattered across thousands of tablets, allow us to recognize the humanity of Sumerian musicians. They were not so different from musicians today, dedicated to their craft, proud of their abilities, vulnerable to economic and political forces beyond their control, finding meaning and satisfaction in creating beauty through sound. Part 5. We have journeyed through 4,000 years to encounter the world's oldest written songs. We have spent these 4 hours together, exploring every dimension of Sumerian hymns, from their religious significance to their technical construction, from the lives of the musicians who performed them to their lasting influence on subsequent musical traditions. Now, as we prepare to conclude, let us gather our thoughts and reflect on what endures from this ancient civilization that vanished so long ago. What have we learned? What insights have emerged from this extended meditation on Sumerian music? What connections can we draw between these ancient songs and our own musical experiences? First, we have learned that sophisticated musical culture emerged early in human history. The Sumerians were not primitive people groping toward art. They possessed complex theories, diverse instruments, elaborate compositional techniques, and deep understanding of music's power to move human hearts and bridge the gap between earthly and divine realms. Their achievements challenge simplistic narratives of cultural evolution that position ancient peoples as less developed than modern ones. The sophistication of Sumerian music theory, particularly the systematic approach to tuning and scale construction, rivals theoretical work from much later periods. The mathematical precision with which they calculated interval ratios demonstrates intellectual rigor equal to any subsequent music theory tradition. When we examine their 7 tuning systems for the 9-string lyre, we recognize that these people thought deeply and systematically about music's fundamental structures. Second, we have seen that music was integrated into every aspect of Sumerian life. It was not entertainment in the modern sense, not separate from serious activities like religion, politics, and economics. Music constituted a fundamental technology for organizing society, communicating with gods, processing emotions, transmitting knowledge, and creating community. This integration meant that musicians held important social positions, that musical training was valued, that resources were devoted to maintaining musical traditions. This holistic approach to music challenges modern compartmentalization. We tend to separate sacred and secular music, art music and entertainment, professional and amateur practice. Sumerians made some of these distinctions, but within framework that recognized music's essential role in all domains of life. Perhaps we can learn from this more integrated approach. Third, we have discovered that writing changed music fundamentally. When hymns were written down, they could be preserved across generations, standardized across regions, studied analytically, and transformed from oral tradition into literature. This did not necessarily make the music better, but it made it different, with new possibilities and new constraints. Writing enabled complexity that would be difficult to maintain in purely oral tradition. It allowed for theoretical reflection that would be impossible without permanent records. It created new relationships between composers, performers, and audiences. The invention of musical writing represents one of humanity's great intellectual achievements. To capture sound, that most ephemeral phenomenon, in permanent form requires abstract thinking of high order. The Sumerians accomplished this, developing notational systems that could transmit musical knowledge across space and time. Every subsequent development in musical writing builds on their foundational innovation. Fourth, we have encountered individual artists across the millennia. Enheduanna is not merely a historical curiosity, but a creative voice whose hymns still resonate with emotional and spiritual depth. The unnamed musicians whose work we have studied were skilled professionals, dedicated practitioners of their craft, people who found meaning in making music. They experienced struggles and triumphs, professional jealousies and collegial support, economic pressures and artistic satisfactions. Recognizing these individual voices reminds us that history is made by particular people with particular lives, not by abstract forces or impersonal processes. Each musician we've discussed, Each name preserved on clay tablets represents a human being who loved and feared, hoped and despaired, worked and rested, just as we do. The gulf of 4,000 years shrinks when we recognize common humanity. The grand arc of music history begins here in Sumer. Everything that comes later builds on these foundations. The hymn tradition spreads throughout the ancient Near East, influencing Hebrew psalms, Greek choruses, early Christian liturgy. The instruments developed in Mesopotamia, lyres, harps, drums, flutes, reappear in modified forms in later cultures. The theoretical insights about tuning, scales, and intervals inform musical thinking for thousands of years. Tracing these influences reveals how cultural transmission works. Ideas spread through trade routes, diplomatic exchanges, military conquests, and individual travels. They are adapted and transformed by each culture that encounters them, creating new syntheses while maintaining connections to original sources. Sumerian music lives on in these transformations, its DNA present in traditions that don't even remember their Mesopotamian origins. But Sumerian music also represents something that was lost. When Sumerian language died, something irreplaceable vanished. The sound of those hymns in their original language, sung by native speakers, accompanied by authentic instruments played with traditional techniques, this can never be fully recovered. We can approximate, reconstruct, imagine, but we cannot resurrect the complete reality. This loss is poignant but not tragic. Every culture transforms and evolves. Every musical tradition eventually gives way to something new. The Sumerians themselves adapted and changed, absorbing foreign influences, modifying conventions, responding to new circumstances. Cultural continuity is always partial, always provisional. Change is not failure, but the natural process of culture living. What endures is not the literal sounds, but the human impulse to create beauty through organized sound. Every culture does this in its own way, but all cultures do it. Music is not a luxury or an ornament, but a fundamental expression of human consciousness. The Sumerians knew this. They devoted enormous resources to musical culture because they understood that music matters. Their temples employed dozens of musicians. Their kings claimed musical ability as royal virtue. Their poets composed elaborate hymns that required years of training to perform properly. Their craftspeople created instruments of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. Their theorists developed systematic understanding of musical structures. All this effort demonstrates conviction that music deserves humanity's best talents and greatest resources. In our modern world, we sometimes forget music's sacred dimensions. We treat it as entertainment, background noise, commodity. Music is commercialized, reduced to product consumed passively rather than actively created and experienced. The Sumerian approach was different. Music was work, serious work, requiring training, discipline, and dedication. It was also gift, grace, blessing, a medium through which humans could transcend ordinary consciousness and touch the divine. Perhaps we can learn from this ancient perspective, not to adopt literally Sumerian beliefs about gods and goddesses, but to remember that music connects us to something beyond ourselves. Whether we interpret that connection in religious or secular terms matters less than recognizing it exists. Music has power to move us, to create community, to express what words cannot capture, to make life more than mere survival. The hymn to Ninkasi celebrates beer, but it also celebrates community, the pleasure of shared refreshment, the gratitude owed to forces that sustain life. The lament for mourns destruction, but it also affirms that suffering matters, that loss deserves recognition, that hope persists even in the darkest circumstances. Enheduanna's exaltation of Inanna expresses devotion, but it also embodies the courage to cry out in anguish and the faith that such cries will be heard. These are not merely historical curiosities. They are human documents, expressions of experiences that transcend their specific cultural context. We can respond to them, let them move us, find in them reflections of our own hopes, fears, and aspirations. A lament composed 4,000 years ago for a destroyed city can still touch modern hearts familiar with loss. A hymn to a goddess we don't worship can still convey authentic devotional feeling. A drinking song from ancient Mesopotamia can still make us smile. The music itself, the actual sounds, remain partially mysterious. Anne Kilmer's reconstruction of the Hurrian hymn gives us something, a window into the ancient world, but we cannot be certain it captures exactly what Sumerian ears heard. Perhaps this uncertainty is appropriate. Music lives in performance, in the particular moment of listening. No two performances are identical. No two listeners hear exactly the same thing. What matters is that people 4,000 years ago cared about music enough to develop sophisticated ways of creating, teaching, preserving, and thinking about it. They left us texts, instruments, images, and theoretical writings. They left us the memory of their caring. When we study their music, we honor that caring. We recognize that their work mattered. We affirm continuity across vast gulfs of time. If these Sumerian hymns have intrigued you, where can you turn to hear reconstructions and related music? What resources exist for deeper exploration? How can you continue engaging with this ancient tradition beyond tonight's episode? Anne Kilmer's reconstruction of the Hurrian hymn has been recorded by several ensembles. The most accessible version appears on an album titled Sounds from Silence: Recent Discoveries in Ancient Near Eastern Music. This recording includes not only the Hurrian hymn but also other ancient melodies reconstructed from fragmentary sources. The performances are scholarly but also musical, balancing historical accuracy with aesthetic appeal. Kilmer worked closely with musicians to create these recordings, ensuring that they reflected her understanding of ancient performance practice while also being enjoyable to listen to. The result is music that educates while also providing genuine aesthetic pleasure. You can hear echoes of authentic ancient sound while also experiencing well-crafted musical performance. The ensemble Sarband has created an album called The Music of Ancient Sumer, Assyria, and Babylonia, which offers speculative but scholarly reconstructions of various hymns and instrumental pieces. They use replica instruments built according to archaeological evidence and apply what we know about ancient tuning systems and performance practices. The result is evocative and beautiful, giving modern listeners some sense of how ancient music might have sounded. Sarband's approach combines scholarship with imagination. Where evidence is clear, they follow it precisely. Where evidence is ambiguous or absent, they make informed guesses based on comparative analysis with other ancient traditions and general principles of musical construction. Their recordings sound both ancient and alive, transporting listeners to another time while remaining musically engaging. For a more contemporary approach, the composer Peter Pringle has recorded several Sumerian hymns using replica lyres he built himself. His versions are freely available online through various platforms. Pringle's recordings emphasize the meditative, contemplative qualities of this music, making it accessible to contemporary audiences seeking peaceful listening experiences. Pringle's lyre construction is itself noteworthy. He studied archaeological reports and museum specimens, learning ancient building techniques. His instruments use materials similar to those available to ancient craftspeople, with adjustments only where necessary for practical reasons. The sound of his lyres probably resembles authentic Sumerian instruments more closely than modern reconstructions using modern materials. If you want to understand the scholarly debates about Sumerian music, Professor Anne Kilmer's academic articles remain essential reading. Her 1972 article, The Discovery of an Ancient Mesopotamian Theory of Music, published in Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society, lays out the fundamental evidence for understanding Sumerian tuning systems. It is technical but accessible to motivated non-specialists willing to work through the mathematical arguments. Kilmer's article revolutionized our understanding of ancient music. Before her work, many scholars assumed that ancient peoples lacked theoretical understanding of music. Kilmer demonstrated conclusively that Mesopotamian musicians had sophisticated music theory, systematic approaches to tuning, and technical vocabulary for discussing musical concepts. Her work opened new avenues of research and inspired musicians to attempt authentic reconstructions. For broader context about ancient Mesopotamian culture, look to Jean Bottero's Mesopotamia, Writing, Reasoning, and the Gods, or Gwendolyn Leake's The Babylonians. An introduction. These books provide excellent overviews of Sumerian and Babylonian civilization, including discussions of music within larger cultural frameworks. They situate music in context of religion, politics, economics, and social life, helping readers understand how music functioned in actual ancient societies. Bottero's book is particularly valuable for understanding Mesopotamian thought patterns. He explores how cuneiform writing shaped conceptual thinking, how religious beliefs structured daily life, how abstract reasoning developed in ancient context. Music appears throughout as an important thread in cultural fabric, connected to all other aspects of civilization. The British Museum in London houses many of the most important artifacts related to Sumerian music, including the Golden Lyre of Ur. The University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia also has significant collections from Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur. Both museums offer online resources, including photographs, descriptions, and educational materials that allow remote exploration of their collections. Virtual museum visits can be surprisingly satisfying. High-resolution photographs reveal details that might be missed during in-person visits. Accompanying texts provide context and interpretation. Interactive features allow exploration from multiple angles. While nothing replaces direct encounter with ancient objects, digital resources make Sumerian artifacts accessible to anyone with internet connection. For those interested in cuneiform texts, the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, maintained by the University of Oxford, provides translations of thousands of Sumerian literary works, including many hymns. The website is free and offers both English translations and discussions of textual variants and scholarly debates. This resource is invaluable for anyone wanting to read actual Sumerian texts rather than just summaries. The corpus includes detailed annotations explaining difficult passages, identifying literary conventions, and comparing different versions of texts that exist in multiple copies. Scholars can access transliterations and even images of original tablets. Students and interested laypeople can read translations with explanatory notes. The resource serves multiple audiences at different levels of expertise. If you play an instrument yourself, you might experiment with modes derived from Sumerian tuning systems. Take a standard Western scale and modify it slightly, adding or subtracting certain intervals, and see what emotional qualities emerge. This kind of experimentation can give you embodied understanding of how tuning affects musical expression, understanding that no amount of reading can provide. Try playing simple melodies using these modified scales. Notice how different intervals create different emotional effects. Bright intervals sound joyful or energetic. Dark intervals sound somber or mysterious. Unusual intervals sound exotic or strange. Through experimentation, you can discover how ancient musicians might have chosen particular scales for particular purposes. For meditation or sleep, any reconstruction of ancient Near Eastern music can serve beautifully. The music's modal character, its avoidance of dramatic contrasts, its steady rhythms and flowing melodies, all these qualities make it ideal for deep listening and relaxation. Let the music transport you to another time and place where the pressures of modern life dissolve into ancient rhythms. The repetitive patterns in ancient music make it especially suitable for meditation and sleep. Repetition with subtle variation creates hypnotic effect, focusing attention while allowing mind to wander freely. The absence of jarring transitions means you won't be suddenly awakened or jolted from relaxed state. The music supports rest rather than demanding alertness. We have walked together through the temples and palaces of ancient Sumer. We have heard hymns to Enheduanna and Ninkasi, laments for fallen cities, songs of praise and supplication. We have met Enheduanna, the world's first named composer, and the countless unnamed musicians whose work sustained their civilization's spiritual life. We have explored instruments and tuning systems, performance practices and social contexts, theoretical developments and practical applications. 4,000 years separate us from these people, but music bridges that vast gulf. When we hear reconstructions of Sumerian hymns, imperfect though they may be, we connect directly with human beings who lived and loved, worked and worried, created beauty and found meaning through sound. Their concerns were not so different from ours. They sought divine blessing, they mourned losses, they celebrated joys, they struggled with economic pressures and political uncertainties. The clay tablets on which these hymns were written are fragile. Many have been destroyed over the millennia, lost to decay, fire, war, or simple neglect. But some survived, buried in ancient ruins, waiting to be discovered by archaeologists. These survivors bear witness to the power of writing, the human desire to preserve what matters most. Writing grants a kind of immortality, allowing thoughts and songs to outlive their creators. Music written down becomes immortal in a way oral tradition can never achieve. Enheduanna's hymns might still be sung 4,000 years from now, carried forward by scholars and musicians who care about preserving humanity's oldest artistic expressions. This is the gift writing gives us: continuity across time, memory that transcends individual lives. Each generation that copies, translates, performs, or studies these texts extends their life, keeps them alive in human consciousness. If this musical journey brought you peace, I would be grateful if you would subscribe. New episodes arrive every Friday at 6 p.m. GMT, each exploring different chapter in music history, each designed for peaceful rest and deep learning. You will find a playlist of all episodes perfect for extended rest, allowing the history of music to unfold gradually as you drift into sleep. There is no rush, no pressure. History waits patiently for whenever you're ready to continue the journey. Next Friday, we will explore the musical world of ancient Egypt and Egyptian temple music, rituals of the pharaohs. We will discover how music functioned in Egyptian religion, what instruments accompanied temple rituals, and how Egyptian musical culture both paralleled and diverged from Sumerian traditions. Together, we will walk along the Nile, hearing the songs of priests and priestesses who served Amun-Ra, Osiris, and Hathor. We will explore the sistrum's sacred sound, the harp's elegant curves, and the mysterious music preserved in tomb paintings. Until then, rest well. Let the ancient hymns linger in your consciousness as you sleep, reminding you that music has always been central to human experience. The Sumerians knew what we sometimes forget, that life without music is life diminished. They devoted their finest talents and greatest resources to creating beauty through sound. That commitment echoes across millennia, reaching us even now, inviting us to remember what truly matters. The world's oldest songs still sing. They sing of gods and goddesses, of grain and beer, of love and loss, of cosmic order and human longing. They sing in a language no one speaks anymore, yet their message transcends language. Beauty endures, art matters, music connects us to something larger than ourselves. These truths were known 4,000 years ago and remain true today. Rest well, and know that somewhere, across the vast expanse of history, musicians in ancient Sumer sang songs similar to those we have explored tonight. They sang in temple courtyards at dawn, accompanied by lyre and drum, their voices rising toward heaven, carrying prayers to gods who may or may not have listened, but who certainly inspired some of humanity's first great art. The echo of those ancient songs reaches across 4 millennia to touch us now. Sleep peacefully. Let history embrace you. Tomorrow is another day, but tonight belongs to Sumer, to Enheduanna and Ninkasi, to lyres and hymns, to music that has waited 4,000 years to be heard again. Rest in the knowledge that beauty, once created, never truly dies. It sleeps, waiting to be awakened, and tonight you have awakened something very old and very precious. The night deepens around us. Stars wheel overhead as they did when Sumerian musicians performed under ancient skies. The same constellations look down on ziggurat courtyards where hymns rose toward heaven. The same moon, Nana himself in Sumerian belief, illuminated clay tablets where scribes recorded sacred songs. We are connected to that ancient world through time's long thread, through shared humanity, through music that speaks across millennia. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift like smoke from temple incense. Let the weight of 4,000 years of history press gently upon you, not as burden but as gift, as connection to long chain of human creativity stretching back to civilization's dawn. You are part of that chain now, having listened to these ancient songs, having opened your mind to voices from the deep past. The Sumerians believed that music pleased the gods. Whether gods exist, whether they listen to our songs, we cannot know with certainty. But we know that music pleases humans, that it has always pleased humans, that the impulse to create organized sound is as old as humanity itself. In honoring Sumerian music, we honor that impulse, we recognize its power, we participate in tradition older than cities, older than writing, perhaps as old as consciousness itself. Good night, rest deeply. Dream of ancient temples and golden lyres, of hymns rising at dawn, of musicians whose names are lost but whose songs survive. Dream of Enheduanna composing her fierce poetry, of brewers singing to Ninkasi while making beer, of laments rising from ruined cities. Dream of human creativity refusing to die, finding ways to survive across time's vast desert. And when you wake, remember that the same creative impulse that animated those ancient musicians lives in you. Whether you make music or simply listen, whether you study history or simply appreciate beauty, you participate in humanity's ongoing song, the great chorus of voices across time saying, "We were here, we created beauty, we mattered." This is Sumer's gift to us, and our gift to the future, the knowledge that human creativity endures, that beauty matters, that songs echo across eternity. Rest now, sleep well. The ancient world watches over you with patient love, asking nothing, offering everything, waiting to share its treasures with anyone willing to listen. Good night.